so that nobody in the screen responded. Okay, no wonder. Okay, let us start it. Good morning, those who are here in Dallas, and then also good evening for those who are joining from Japan. Thank you for coming to this symposium, and especially today, interesting panels. First, I thank Consulate General of Japan in Houston for their support for the SMU Tower Center. We have a representative from the Consulate General, Takahashi-san. Please join me for acknowledging. Okay, and also today we have Honorary Consul General and also previous Honorary Consul General of Japan in Dallas, the current Honorary Consul General of Japan in Dallas, Mr. Sam Shijo. Sorry. And also a former Consul General of Japan in Dallas, and for 12 years, actually 16 years. Okay, yeah, you are already a Consul General of Japan in Dallas when I came to Dallas 14 years ago. Mr. Johnston. Thank you very much for your support for Sun Star program on Japan East Asia in the Tower Center for past now more than a decade. So thank you very much. Yesterday we had we started with the very stimulating keynote speech by Ambassador Yoichi Suzuki. And he went over the history of international trade, and then actually especially the politics of international trade. And the later today, we have a keynote speech by Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC, Dr. Michael Beeman. And so when I talked with him, always we say like trade politics is more important than trade economics. Things follow politics more than economics. There are two changes that have occurred for last 4 decades. One is the rise of China. So China's presence in the world is very different, totally different now from 4 decades ago. At the same time, another thing is now the trade is very different. So it is based on the global value chains. And so that when manufacturers manufacture the products, they do not produce the products in one factory, but every stage of the production is located in different factories, and then those different factories are located in different countries. So the trade is based on the global value chains, and then like what is traded is intermediate goods. So that's actually that changes also the politics of trade. 2 decades ago, so that is actually so for us, for me, and then also for those who are probably older than me, would say that 2 decades ago is like a kind of yesterday. I was a graduate student at the time, but for the undergraduate students, that's actually when you were born, right? So, but 2 decades ago, President George W. Bush, who lived actually very close to SMU campus, said that he thought that when he became president, he thought that the United States would have to change the policy toward China. Incorporating the reality of the new reality of China's rise, and then he appointed our friends Ambassador Tom Schiffer to be ambassador to Australia. And then when he appointed him to ambassador to Australia, he said that he said that he appoints him to ambassador to Australia because Australia is crucially important. And then another country is important to confront the rise of China is Japan. So he thought that his idea was, we have to manage China's rise, and then from the north and south in the other side of Pacific Ocean, and then Japan and Australia are the important allies. Do you hear some like a bell ringing here? That's actually exactly what the Biden administration is saying right now. Right. So 2 decades ago, 2 decades later, Biden administration is somehow realizing the policy that President George W. Bush was trying to implement 2 decades ago. Of course, what has happened just after what has happened for the last 2 decades, just after his inauguration in the same year, 9/11 in 2001, and then also later global financial crisis, and then President Bush's original policy of the new policy towards China cannot be implemented. I'm not saying that U.S. should move the policy from engagement to containment. I don't think it's impossible, and then also I don't think it's possible, or I don't think it's a good idea to really simply contain China. Needless to say, I don't think decoupling is a good idea because of the other change of what happened last 2 decades. That is the global value chain. China is different from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's part of and the major part of economic interdependence of the international economy. So we have to incorporate China, but we have to incorporate China as a player following the rules, and then we have to set the rules. And then various trade agreements like Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then Japan-EU EPA that Ambassador Suzuki was the chief negotiator from the Japanese side. And then also we have USMCA. And then in East Asia, now they have RCEP. So various trade rule making has been going on to respond to the new reality of the 2 things: one, the global value chains emergence, and China's rise. So today we have 2 panels. The first panel talks about security aspect, and then the other panel talks about economic aspect. So I hope you will enjoy it. I am very much looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the panelists for the first panel, and then it starts with speaker from Japan, Professor and Dr. Mieko Nakabayashi. So today's format is a speaker will speak for 10 minutes or so, 10 to 12 minutes, and then we have a discussant, my colleague Shaheen Varanji, and he's an expert of international security. And then move to another speaker, and then commentary by the discussant, and then move to the next speaker. So and then after 3 rounds of the presentation and this discussion, we will open to the floor. So please think about your comments and your thoughts, your question, and I hope this will be a very lively discussion. So I'd like to welcome Professor Mieko Nakabayashi. Professor Nakabayashi is, let me ping her. I should unping first. And oh, no. Okay. So Professor Nakabayashi is welcome, and then good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Now it's already past the 10 p.m. in Tokyo. And such a late time. Thank you very much. She has a very unique background. She's a prominent political scientist, PhD of political science from University of Osaka, and then currently the professor, political scientist, teaching at Waseda University. And but she was a lawmaker in Japan. She was a Diet member from 2009 to 2012 as a lawmaker of the Democratic Party of Japan. That was a ruling party at that time. And then also she was working as a staff member of Congress, U.S. Congress, for I think 10 years in her earlier career. So she has a very interesting experience of both academia as well as a practitioner. She's a leading expert of the U.S.-Japan relations. So I'm very much looking forward to her comments today. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Nakabayashi.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the great introduction. I am almost, feeling too flattered. First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. I am very honored to be on this panel. I heard my role, because I am participating from Tokyo, my role is to explain from Japanese perspective about US-Japan relations and Japanese changing foreign policy in terms of national security. Well, but actually, economic security and defense policy are these days intertwined very closely. It is almost difficult to divide them these days. We can, of course, think about Quad, including Australia and so on, and TPP or TPP excluding the United States, as well as actually RCEP, that China is a great player in there, and well, maybe England and other Western countries important role playing in TPP. And China and Taiwan also raised their hands to join the TPP. So there are lots of aspects, not only related to economics, but also national security type of issues. With regard to that, let me share a few slides so that I can just highlight some thoughts from Japan. Then I can, of course, discuss with the other panelists about Japanese situation and international relations. First of all, Japan is trying to change its national security policy by the end of the year. Also, Prime Minister Kishida is saying that he is actually trying to pass a law to integrate Japanese national security and economic policy. But in order to discuss about that, it is important to understand what's going on currently under this extraordinary time of war against Ukraine. So let me introduce what Japan did after Russia started to attack Ukraine on the 24th of February. It starts from the bottom, and this is from National Law Review and updated on 29th of March. Japan announced with other nations to join using SWIFT to give a strict and very harsh economic sanction against Russia, as you know already. And on February 25th, Japan actually froze assets held by a major bank in Russia. And on the 3rd of March, they added more sanctions. On the 8th of March, they even added more individuals and all sorts of important people to freeze their assets and other aspects. On the 15th of March, lately, Japan added 17 additional Russian individuals to its sanctions list. So Japan is moving forward. And President of Ukraine spoke in front of Japanese Diet members And he first thanked that Japan was the first nation to announce a very severe sanction against Russia. And it was true. Japan is completely with Western nations because it shares the value of democracy and freedom, justice, and all sorts of things that we really treasure as human beings. However, as you know, when Japan participates in such a strict, severe sanction against Russia, Japan's energy situation gets really difficult. As you can see on this chart, this is actually, the data is from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, but Japan Times nicely put it into a great chart like this. And in fiscal 2019, actually this chart was published by the Japan Times in 2021, last year, and using fiscal year 2019 number. And Japan is greatly, as you can see, relying on LNG. Russia is very strong about this one, and coal, nuclear energy, and renewable energy, as well as oil and others in this white area. And Japanese government announced that they will change its composition and make the renewable energy even larger source of its electricity. By actually fiscal year 2030, and nuclear energy should be expanded, and LNG should be shrunk, and coal should be even shrunk more, and oil should be around 2%. But this is a goal that the Japanese government announced once. Of course, this can be changed depending on what's going on about nuclear energy and so on. And Ukraine is having such a difficult time because Russia attacked nuclear energy source of Ukraine, and Japan is, as you can imagine, worried about nuclear energy plant. If Japan is attacked by someone, and the war in Ukraine is not someone else's affair. It is directly affecting Japanese sense of national security, as you can imagine. Also, Japan's crude oil imports are coming from Saudi Arabia, mostly 35.8% in 2019, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, and so on. And Russia has 5.4%. So this is another thing that Japan should be worried about, but not as much as other nations in Middle East. In also 2019, energy situation in Japan with regard to LNG has this kind of countries that Japan is importing from. The biggest nation for Japan to import is Australia, almost 40%. Malaysia, Qatar, and Russia, 8%. So this is another issue that Japan has to worried about with regard to the war against Ukraine. The United States asked Japan to actually give up some reserve or promise to import LNG, even including from other countries, to shift it or give that to European countries. And Prime Minister Kishida promised to do it as much as possible. Japan has some reserve, so it can afford to do that for a while, but not, of course, not forever, as you can imagine. Also, Japan is trying to shift its like energy composition from 1933, as you can see in this graph, to 2010. They changed a little bit, expanded nuclear energy, and then 2017 they changed a little bit. But in any event, oil, LNG, and other things are also an important source for Japanese energy. And crude oil supply sources for Asian countries compared to other countries, Japan's situation is not as greatly depending on Russian, for example, oil or energy source, I mean. China is importing from Middle East, also Africa, also Russia and CIS. But for Japan, as you can see, Middle East is the biggest importing source, and then Russia has a little bit around here in orange. This is energy situation, and of course it is extremely vital for Japanese economy. And just for your information, stock levels in days of major oil consuming nations as of May 2019, Japan has oil reserve for 187 days. Denmark has much more, and the United States has much more. And the United States is such a nation that can even produce oil and other energy source. But Japan doesn't have that kind of capacity, but it has so-so reserve to keep Japanese economy going on for a while. And let me introduce Japanese latest poll taken in March from 25th to 27th by Nikkei Shimbun, and it was published on the 28th of March. That is actually yesterday in Japan time. And it asked whether here sanctions against Russia is good or enough or not. 44% of Japanese people said it is about right, but 41% of Japanese people said Japan need more sanction against Russia. Very interesting result. Actually, every day in Japan, we are seeing the atrocity and the tragedy of Ukraine people, and all sorts of dramas and stories of civilians over there. So Japanese sentiment is strongly with Ukrainian people. This kind of everyday news and information, I'm sure, are affecting people's mind. And another question, whether Japanese people are welcoming Ukrainian refugees from Ukraine. 90%, 90% of Japanese people said we should welcome the refugees from Ukraine. This is a very, very strong sentiment. And according to yesterday's release of the poll, Japanese people was asked whether Prime Minister Abe's approach to deal with Russia and Northern Ireland should be continued or revised. Interestingly, 52% of Japanese people said we should. And some other people, like 30 some people, said maybe we can keep it and reopen the negotiation and so on and so forth. But most people said, more than half of the Japanese people said, we should completely revise it. Russia is not the nation that we thought. The last one here on the right bottom, Japanese people were asked whether they were concerned about the effect of the war in Ukraine with regard to Taiwan. Surprisingly, so many people, 77% of people said, well, this situation in Ukraine would affect China's attitude against Taiwan. They believe that they would happen. 77% of the people said that. So you can now imagine what kind of feeling that Japanese people are having because of the situation in the world affairs, particularly the war in Ukraine. The same Nikkei Shimbun asked the people whether they would support Kishida administration or not. In general, in overall, recently, 2 percentage points were seen to be raised lately. I guess because COVID-19 cases declined a little bit, although today and yesterday the number went up. But usually these days, Prime Minister's support rate is correspondent with COVID-19 cases. In any event, in this poll, Nikkei Shimbun asked whether they would support Kishida's policy on Russia and Ukraine. 69% of the Japanese people said they would support the current stance of Kishida administration against Russia and Ukraine. And 22% of the people said they wouldn't support. Maybe some people think that we should be stricter against Russia and support Ukraine more, according to the previous question. See, 41% of Japanese people think that we should have more sanction against Russia. Therefore, there may be some people within this 22% that those people who are not supporting Kishida's current policy against Russia and Ukraine's affair. Well, this year, Prime Minister Kishida had the first meeting with President Biden online, and they promised to work together and keep the alliance stronger and make it work in better way. And Japanese Prime Minister promised to come up with a better national security policy by the end of this year and introduce economic national security policy that would link economic policy and national security very closely. And there are lots of details about that. The huge problem is that this is from CIPRI's data released in 2021. Japan's security budget has only 1% of its GDP, the lowest among lots of nations, as you can see on this chart. Therefore, Japan must raise defense budget. However, Japan is running so much budget deficits, more than like a 250% of its GDP. And even Mr. Kishida is having a difficult time to raise this percentage. We will see whether the diet would come up with any good idea to reduce budget deficit and to deal with economic welfare and all sorts of things, and keep Japanese economy healthy and so on and so forth, and raise Japanese defense budget. We will see. But I can imagine it's going to be a very difficult task for Prime Minister Kishida to raise this much more than the current budget. Well, tour to describe Japanese situation, and I look forward to discuss with other panelists today. Thank you very much for your time and looking at my well, very, very quick slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our discussant of this panel, Dr. Shaheen Varanji. He's actually my, in Japanese called Kohai. That is, we went to the same university for our PhD. He's a PhD from UCLA. And he's an expert of international security. He has been postdoc lecturer of SMU Political Science Department for last 2 years. I really appreciate his contribution to our teaching. He is departing SMU for Texas A&M University Bush School for his new position this coming fall. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Varanji.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. And thank you, Dr. Nakabayashi, for that most interesting presentation. I think there are a lot of things that I wanted to talk about with you. I think first about energy policy, because energy policy is so closely intertwined with security, with national security. Having reliable, stable access to oil, to natural gas, is critical. This was a big reason why the United States was so involved in the Middle East during the Cold War, to try to deny the Soviet Union oil, to try to deny the Soviet Union influence over the oil markets. It explains the US position when Iraq invaded Kuwait and when Iraq posed a threat to Saudi Arabia. And Japan, because it is an island nation, because it does not produce its own oil, because it does not have access to natural gas, is in a more vulnerable position than many other countries in the world. Japan and South Korea, both of them are actually in this situation. Vulnerable because they not only don't produce oil and natural gas, but vulnerable because they're dependent on tanker shipments to receive oil and liquefied natural gas. There's no pipeline, there's no oil or gas pipeline to give them consistent, reliable access. They're reliant on these tanker shipments, most of which come from the Middle East, as you pointed out. So I think a couple of questions that I had in mind, and we could kind of discuss it now, or perhaps move it forward into the Q&A, is to what degree or to what extent, I know Japan has a great fear and anxiety about the rise of China and the threats that it can pose, both militarily, of course, and as well as economically. But could a part of this threat, particularly China's moves in the South China Sea right now to stake out an area, basically, or carve out a part of the South China Sea the size of Mexico, Could part of Japan's anxiety be tied to energy? Because understanding that all these oil tankers have to go through the South China Sea to get to Japan, giving China access to interrupt Japanese trade, because as an island nation, it's fully dependent on trade. So I'm wondering, to what extent is this concern about the economic impacts, and particularly as it relates to the South China Sea dispute, is that a factor in driving Japan's anxiety and fears about the rise of China? Because I mean, it's quite easy if China decided to close down, or put limits, or let's say threaten the South China Sea in trade, that would have a great impact on the Japanese economy. So I guess the fact is energy, the effect of energy on Japanese national security. Also, Japan's policy towards Iran, or the revival of the Iran nuclear agreement, because Japan stands to benefit immensely if Iran is able to sell its oil and liquefied natural gas on the open market again, if the sanctions are removed and Japan can access it. The price of oil and natural gas would also come down, because Iran has one of the largest reserves of natural gas, and it also has large crude oil reserves as well. So I was wondering if you could elaborate or expand on Japan's policy on the Iran revival of the Iran nuclear agreement. That would be kind of an interesting angle to kind of get a better sense for, because I imagine that Japan would be quite interested in something like that. And I guess another few issues I had is just the ability and the degree to which Japan has become a champion of the liberal world order, promoting and helping to strengthen democracies, promoting free trade agreements to encourage economic interdependence and economic interconnectedness, supporting and funding international institutions like the United Nations and other UN kind of associated groups. How has Japan managed to keep up the consensus to support the liberal world order, when if you look at Europe, you look at even the United States, the rise of populist parties, the rise of right-wing parties that really criticize or critique these foundations of the liberal world order. And these countries range from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, to even here in the United States with the election of course, Donald Trump in 2016. So how has Japan managed to maintain that support? That to me is very puzzling. It's very interesting, because Japan still, there seems to be a consensus that this is the way to go, that this is a successful model. There doesn't seem to be a questioning of the liberal world order as there has been in many other countries, including here in the United States. And finally, my question is about Prime Minister Kishida, and whether or not he possesses the same resolve to move Japan's national security in the same direction as Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe, of course, has wanted to amend Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which Japan places certain limits on Japan and its ability to use force abroad. There are certain parts of Article 9, certain phrases, such as the renunciation of war, or the use of war as an instrument of statecraft, or as kind of an ability. Japan also, as part of Article 9, I believe, really is constrained in terms of developing offensive weapons and certain types of offensive capabilities. Shinzo Abe had for years been trying to amend this, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. Shinzo Abe had also pushed Japan to try to bolster its role in Asia and around the world, commensurate with the scale and power of its economy. To what degree is the current Prime Minister Kishida resolved to pursue in those same footsteps? I mean, to what degree is he committed to make Japan play a prominent role in the international arena, to expand and to increase Japanese military spending, to make it easier for Japanese security forces to pursue military operations abroad, and to give Japan the types of offensive capabilities that it might need to fight a war against the threat posed by China, or to deal with the threat posed by China, or to deal with the threat posed by rogue actors like North Korea. So that's an interesting question, and it kind of it begs the question of whether there is some continuity in the national and foreign policies of Shinzo Abe and the current Prime Minister Kishida.
Okay, thank you. Let's move actually. Instead of asking Dr. Nakabayashi to answer those questions that probably require another hour to answer, now I'd like to introduce my colleague, my friend, Professor Diana Newton. I think that those who are in Dallas know her very well. Many of you know her very well. She actually was the only Japan specialist when I came to SMU 14 years ago. And she, well, basically, she was one of those who hired me. And I really have enjoyed working with her since then. She is the founding director of Sunstar Fund in Japanese Studies, which I'm currently directing. She is the founding director of SMU's Our Scholars Program, which is one of the best programs in SMU, recruiting the best students of the SMU. She has been managing that Our Scholars Program. And then this semester, I'm really enjoying co-teaching a class for Our Scholars Program students. We are working for the project with the Sumitomo Corporation of Americas, and we really truly are enjoying working with Sumitomo, and I'm really enjoying co-teaching with Diana. So please join me for welcoming Professor Diana Newton.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hiroki, for a great introduction. I, like Nakabayashi Sensei, feel very honored and maybe overly flattered, but thank you. Really grateful to my co-panelists, Nakabayashi Sensei, Will Norris, and our discussant, Shaheen Varanji, who's a great colleague here at SMU, and we'll miss him as he goes off to be with Will Norris at Texas A&M. So my job is to give the U.S. perspective on the U.S.-Japan security relationship. And so I'm going to start actually from the 10,000-foot level and talk a little bit about where the United States stands right now in terms of its global stature and its status as a world power, which I would say, to be honest, isn't so great right now, right? Literally and figuratively. Many people blame President Trump for this slide in reputation and reliability, and I think there is some blame to be placed on the inconsistent and somewhat incomprehensible policies of the Trump administration. But I don't think that America started this decline in 2016 or this retreat from the world stage. I think it really began with the Obama administration. And I think the red line comment made by President Obama with respect to Bashir al-Assad and his potential use of chemical weapons against his own people in the war in Syria was really the moment that signaled the beginning of America's desire to be less involved on the world stage and in the world's conflicts. Less interested in continuing the role, our self-assumed role as the world's policeman. which maybe is not surprising after a global war on terror that, America would feel the need to sort of retrench after the Bush administration. Then, of course, this was followed by the roller coaster of the Trump administration policies by tweet, which was hard for all of us, I think, to follow. And then instead of bringing the United States back to its reliable role as big brother of the world, President Biden took office in January and pulled the United States out of Afghanistan in August, which was sort of disruptive, not well thought out, not perfectly executed. So I think the world was sort of left wondering, again, what kind of ally or partner did the United States really want to be? But long before the US departure from Afghanistan, soon-to-be Biden administration officials were signaling a shift in actions and leadership that they had planned for the US role in Asia. Just weeks before they were appointed to positions in the Biden administration, Kirk Campbell and Ray Doshi, now working at the highest level of US national security policymaking, referred to Chinese assertiveness and US ambivalence in an article that they said those two things are putting the region in flux in a Foreign Affairs magazine article. Explicitly referring to a rising China and a retreating America, the co-authors argued that the US needed to address both problems by sharing the burden and spreading the responsibility across alliances. And they focused on revising the US policy in three ways. First, they suggested the US needed to move away from military primacy. They needed to invest in relatively inexpensive and asymmetric capabilities, such as cruise and ballistic missiles and submarines, rather than aircraft carriers. Second, they argued that the United States should be serious about re-engaging in the region, including showing up at regional summits and increasing cooperation with regional countries while persuading Beijing to try and play by the rules. And third, they argued that the United States needed to be flexible in building relationships in the region, prioritizing specific issues for ad hoc coalitions, and to avoid kind of grand bargains or grand coalitions that would sort of resolve all problems, but to rather pursue an ad hoc policy in the region. And in this broader context of promoting sort of building relationships, joining different organizations, sharing the burden of a free and secure Pacific region with allies, the United States also put a lot of stock into its Indo-Pacific Strategy, a 19-page document that it released in February of 2022, so just last month. And it focuses on, and I quote, attaining a free and open Indo-Pacific that is more connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient, end quote. And I should also note that the free and open Indo-Pacific term was coined by Prime Minister Abe and then widely adopted throughout the US government. The Indo-Pacific Strategy that the US just published proposes doing so by, quote, building collective capacity with allies and partners and regional institutions through modernized alliances and flexible partnerships. It argues for new US defense, diplomatic, development, and foreign assistance resources. And it calls on, quote, an empowered ASEAN, a leading India, a strong and reliable Quad, and an engaged Europe. It also promises a sustained focus on and commitment to the region at all levels of US government. So I think while many people heard the Biden campaign say, in contrast to the Trump campaign during the election period, that we weren't going to pursue America first, we were going to prioritize allies, to get back into multilateral negotiations, reconnect with partners. I'm not sure how many of us actually heard the Biden administration say that they were prioritizing modernized alliances and flexible partnerships so that they could have an actually smaller role in them, which I think is what they were saying. And I'm happy to discuss that with others who might disagree with me. So shifting now from that sort of 10,000-foot view of where I think the US is on global stature and strategy in Asia, I want to look at the US-Japan relationship. And there's no question that the United States values the bilateral relationship. It considers the security alliance essential to its strategy and objectives for the region. Japan is an old friend, a reliable friend, a great friend. And I think this is true across every part of the US government. Unusually, we have the legislative branch and the executive branch, I think, everybody agrees on that. I think because Japan is such an old, trusted, and reliable friend, sometimes Japan gets taken for granted, which I think is the concern that the United States should kind of focus on. So I think one thing actually, interestingly, from Nakabayashi-san's comments, like Kishida, the Biden administration also feels that economic policy is national security policy. And so I think that the countries are actually very much in sync. On the positive side of the relationship, or the positive side of the ledger, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, went to Asia very early in the Biden administration in March of last year, stopping in South Korea and Japan. During that trip, the Secretary of Defense Austin explicitly reassured Defense Minister Nobuo Kishi that the United States sees the Senkakus as falling squarely and clearly under the US-Japan Security Alliance. The two countries agreed to create an economic version of the 2x2 security ministerial meetings, which has been seen as a huge accomplishment. And I think while that's economic and not military, this idea that was important tells you, if nothing else, tells you how important the security ministerials are to both sides, that they view an economic version of that would be useful. I think also, and this is luck, you can't plan for this, but it seems so far, even though they've only met virtually, that the personal relationship between Biden and Kishida is good, that the two gentlemen enjoy each other. And I think that's something, again, you can't plan for it, but when it happens, that's terrific. The call that they had went longer than scheduled, which is usually a good sign. And again, they'll meet in Brussels in person at the G7, I think, to continue some bilateral work there. Also, finally, I would say one huge positive has been the selection of the U.S. ambassador to Japan. Rahm Emanuel has hit the ground running. He's doing great work to strengthen the relationship. He is very politically savvy. He is extremely close to President Biden. He is really working this relationship with Japan. He is very high energy, and he's been, by some pundits, given credit for some of the intense and energized and rapid sanctions that, again, Nakabayashi-san put on the screen, that Japan was quick to implement against Russia, and he's been given some credit for working that behind the scenes. Okay, on the negative side of the ledger, I think, the U.S. really doesn't have that much negative to say. The U.S. is pretty pleased with the leadership Japan is showing in terms of economic policy, in terms of a promise to unite economic and national security policy, in terms of an increased desire for military spending and increasing defense stuff in Japan. I think for Japan, there are a few negatives. Obviously, Japan wants the U.S. to keep Asia front and center, I think, but it feels like it has to hedge. There's a frustration, I think, among the world, and actually in our class that Professor Takeuchi and I are team teaching with Sumitomo, they've expressed it as a corporation, that there's going to be another election, and who can guarantee that it won't be won by another boat-rocking candidate in the United States. There's definitely a strong sense in the United States that America needs to do some stuff at home and stop doing things abroad. And I think that concerns all of our allies, but especially Japan. So I think Japan feels the need to shore up and nurture other alliances, just to make sure that it's in a good place, no matter what happens with US politics. Japan's also, I think, and this is a good thing for Japan, gained a lot of confidence in the work that it did through the TPP and creating the CPTPP, moving forward without US leadership, taking the helm and making sure that arrangement happened. And now China and Taiwan want to join that trade deal, and it doesn't look like the United States is going to be able to do that politically for some time. So I think Japan can feel really good about its leadership in the region and probably feels less reliant on the United States. I think this is also somewhat hypothetical, but we just saw it this week, so it's on my mind. President Biden has a lack of discipline in his communications, and I think that could be a liability for Japan, the U.S.-Japan relationship at some point in the future, but that's pure speculation at this point. I think Japan, finds itself prioritizing the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship always, but looking around to be strategic as needed. It's clear that even with a longtime senator with traditional foreign policy chops in the White House, rather than his less experienced predecessor, the United States is retrenching and revamping its global footprint and its plans for how and when it will project power. This is true in Asia as well as around the globe. And although the United States keeps saying it is going to pivot to Asia, other things seem to be getting in the way. Regionally, obviously, current events are pushing Japan and the United States actually closer together, so that's a good thing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has refocused alliances everywhere. A renewed understanding for the need to make sure military equipment is cleaned and serviced, if only after watching the Russian convoy to Kyiv break down in such a dramatic and embarrassing way. Nations are stepping up their financial commitments to NATO. I think other alliances around the world are thinking similarly. We need to maybe spend a little more money. We need to possibly, and Nakabayashi Sensei talked about it, and so did Shaheen, what kind of commitment does this mean, and how much are countries, especially Japan and others, South Korea, willing to put money behind their concerns about defense? I think the Chinese came out very strongly against the idea of an Asian NATO, which tells you a little bit about the threat that maybe they feel about these, other nations in Asia kind of working on their joint defense. So I think that's interesting. Obviously, Chinese, prior to the Ukrainian invasion, there were a lot of Chinese overflights and incursions into Taiwanese air and sea space. Certainly made the US and Japan allies think about why an Asian NATO might be useful. There does not seem to be real interest in such a concept, but I do think there's enhanced interaction between the various militaries, renewed focus on joint military operations and the need for that. We've talked about today already a little bit, but the Quad, which is the US, Japan, India, and Australia, is working together. The AU-KUS alliance, Australia, the UK, and the US, APEC, ASEAN, and I think maybe potentially, fingers crossed, a US ROK, GOJ, so US, South Korea, Japan alliance. The new recently elected president of Korea, President Yoon, has pledged to improve relations with Japan so that the US, Japan, Korea trilateral relationship can more effectively coordinate and collaborate to ward off threats from China or North Korea. And finally, the North Korean missile testing last week has also emphasized to the region the importance of alliances to try and deter misbehavior by autocrats with bombs. So these kinds of threats, China's continued statements and threatening behavior around Taiwan, North Korea's missile testing, breaking the agreement negotiated by President Trump to stop such testing, and Russia's invasion of a sovereign nation all work to strengthen the US-Japan security relationship. But the US is now so consumed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one must wonder if the pivot to Asia will ever come. And I will conclude with the words of the US ambassador to Japan when promoting the US Indo-Pacific Strategy in Japan. And he said, like Japan, we believe that a successful Indo-Pacific vision must advance freedom and openness and offer autonomy and options. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Shaheen, give us a brief comment.
Okay. So I just wanted to ask about whether there is a palpable sense of fear in Japan and around the world that the war in Ukraine has deflected and diverted the United States' attention away from Asia, away from China, in the same way that September the 11th deflected the United States' attention away from Asia and away from other parts of the globe and solely focused the United States on the Middle East. Is the war in Ukraine going to focus the United States' attention now on Europe and on Russia, and therefore undermining that pivot to Asia? And so that's the first question. The second question is about Washington's policy towards the Kuril Islands. There's so the Kuril Islands, of course, remain a big territorial dispute between Japan and Russia. You had spoken about how the U.S. supports Japan's position on the Senkaku Islands. I was wondering if you could elaborate on Washington's position towards the Kuril Islands. And then finally, there's been a move in Tokyo over the past decade to amend Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution to clarify what's to be the mission and purpose of Japan's self-defense forces, to increase military spending, to play a larger role, not just economically, but also perhaps militarily in the world. And Shinzo Abe, in fact, made a statement a little while ago about the possibility of nuclear sharing. He expressed interest that Japan should have access to American nuclear weapons, not that Japan would produce them themselves, but would have access to it. To what extent is this movement in Japan to undo the pacifist legacy? To what extent is this due to Japan's belief that Washington is no longer a reliable ally? That there are questions about Washington's commitment to this region, and it doesn't make a difference who's president, rather than Japan is changing its pacifist legacy because of the rise of China or the rise of North Korea. So I guess if you can weigh these different factors, and which one in your view plays a more prominent role in moving Tokyo to play this more in moving Tokyo to enlarge its military and to make the Japanese self-defense forces play a bigger role in Asia and in the world potentially. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so next speaker is Professor Will Norris, my now old friend, since he was a graduate student, and I just started SMU. I think that was when we met. When he joined the Texas A&M Bush School, I was so happy, and then he was joining from MIT, where he got PhD, and then I had dinner with him and his classmates at MIT, and then told him that, well, now we are in the neighborhood, and his classmates of MIT asked me, like, how far is it between SMU and A&M? And then I said, it's just a 3-hour drive. And people in MIT are like, what? If you drive at 3 hours in Massachusetts, like, how long? How many universities are there? Right. So, Will Norris is a China specialist, and today he talks about the Chinese perspective of U.S.-Japan security alliance. So, Will, please join me for Dr. Will Norris.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hiroki. And it seems every year our friendship gets older and older. This is the problem with time. I wanted to, in terms of the potpourri of perspectives that Hiroki has put together for you all today, my contribution is on the China side. So we've heard from the US perspective, we've heard initially from a great presentation on the Japan perspective, and this is sort of that third piece of the puzzle, China's perspective. And so a lot of my remarks are going to be thinking about it from the perspective of China, because I think that's kind of the unique contribution that this presentation is going to be making. So I will see if we can get this to advance here. Hopefully. There we go. All right. The takeaway, I always like to start any talk with like telling you what the answer is, which is different from what academics usually do, because they want to sort of build up to the grand punchline. But I've done enough stuff in DC to realize that you only have an audience's attention for about 30 seconds. So China's perspective on the alliance is that Japan and the alliance in general is an artifact of the Cold War, and China's perspective toward Japan is deeply embedded in this historical narrative that I would suggest is really hard to ever permanently shake. The relationship between China and Japan can just go through periods of better or worse, but the history is always going to be there, and it's always going to be politically mobilized, particularly from the perspective of China, in my opinion, but also from Japan's perspective. So that's the first one to sort of be aware of. And I think that, interestingly for me, China often doesn't give Japan much by way of its own independent sovereign agency in this dynamic. They tend to think of Japan as being a function of the US-Japan alliance. They don't tend to think about Japan exercising a lot of its own independent agency in international affairs, in my opinion. The third point is that if there's one thing you can remember from today's discussion, it's that China's foreign policy is increasingly being done as a function of its domestic politics. And for the time being, that's all about the 20th Party Congress that's going to take place in October, November of this year. And that's going to color everything that China does in the foreign policy domain, in the foreign policy realm, including its relationship to Japan. And I think what that means, or why we should care about that, is I think it creates a window of possibility for the theme of today's discussion, Japan's new and evolving foreign policy. Because I think that China is going to want to keep everything really stable. They're not going to be prone to overreacting to changes in Japanese strategy or Japanese approach in the region, which I think produces a window for Japan to make some changes here. Am I not on video here?
No.
Sure. I'm good?
Yeah, it's me.
All right. Okay. So let's see. So these are a couple of areas that I think are ripe for cooperation. And this is just a quick little laundry list, but a lot of this is not unfamiliar to folks in this room. And the one thing I would suggest is when Japan decides it wants to do something a little different, which I think it's politically at that moment today, bear in mind these three things. Bear in mind the timing and the signaling that's going to be necessarily involved in any new ideas and new concepts and new frameworks to these areas, how that's going to play to regional third parties. A lot of people in the neighborhood are still quite nervous about Japan and Japan's more active role. I think Japan's attuned to that, but I just want to bring it out to this crowd. How that's going to play in China, vis-a-vis some of these dynamics I'm about to lay out. And then importantly, how it's going to play out domestically, politically. I think the earlier question about Kishida and his appetite for where he wants to go in this, I think is a valid one. I think we're still waiting to sort of see what exactly he wants to do. So these are just kind of a quick overview of what I think are the kind of the structural drivers of Japanese security policy, all of which must be handled in some of these contexts, which I think Diane has already brought up. And the first great presentation, I think, had a lot of these baked into it. But I just wanted to kind of lay that out there. All right. So this is the way I think about, political scientists. There's two important dimensions. So the 2x2 is you have Japan's China policy, and it's a spectrum between engaging more deeply with China or hedging against China's rise. And you have the U.S. alliance, and there's more enhancing support, or there's sort of balancing, reviewing the quality of the alliance. I think today, this is kind of my view of the Japanese political dynamic. Government of Japan is moving in these directions, sort of more towards U.S. alliance relationship and more towards hedging China. So I mean, it's kind of the dynamic and the trajectory of where I see the current layout. All right, so that's kind of the big picture. That's the overview. Now we're going to look at China from China's perspective, and in particular, the domestic politics. It's important to realize where Xi Jinping stands coming out of the 19th Party Congress now 5 years ago. He's really at the apex, I think, of his power, of Xi Jinping's personal political power. I think he has a relatively free hand. The 20th Party Congress can be all about who succeeds him, and importantly, whether or not there's somebody waiting to succeed him, which is I don't want to say that that's a foregone conclusion. There's a very real possibility that the people that walk out on stage, none of them appear eligible in the Standing Committee of the Politburo to succeed Xi Jinping. That's a real possibility. If that happens, I think that's gonna be an important outcome from the 20th Party Congress. I think if there is somebody among those people that come out on the stage who look eligible to succeed Xi Jinping, that's another very important outcome. So either way, pay attention, because it's going to be an important outcome. And I think what's interesting here is what that means for foreign policy, including Taiwan. And I'm going to get to kind of how China's thinking about this. So the 20th Party Congress, these are the key dynamics that we're going to be thinking about, some things that I think are generally accepted as a conventional wisdom for China watchers. And this one I wanted to kind of highlight, because there's been a discussion of Xi Jinping potentially visiting. This is a makeup trip that was canceled because of COVID. And I think that the date is interesting here, because it would be immediately preceding this 20th Party Congress, which is kind of interesting. Just as a point of trivia, does anyone know what was going on at the other 20th Communist Party Congress that has ever taken place that we've paid attention to, which would have been in the Soviet Union? Any guesses? See if this prompts any thoughts. The 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was where Nikita Khrushchev gave the speech, the secret speech, denouncing Stalinization in the Soviet Union. So I think this parallel is not something that's widely known in the United States, but I guarantee the Chinese Communist Party knows what happened at the last 20th Party Congress. And so Xi Jinping is quite aware of these sort of optic dynamics. This, just to be clear, this is not something that the Chinese are bragging about or talking about. This is just some dots that connected in my own brain I thought I'd share with you all today. All right, most recently we had the Lianghui wrap up last week in China. So the readout, generally speaking, people that were there participating kind of in real time, you got the feeling that it was very tightly scripted. There was not a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of innovation. There's not a lot of improvisation. There was a clear game plan. Everyone showed up. They voted their game plan. They went home, checked the box, move on. This is going to be the preferred way that Xi Jinping would like to see all of Chinese politics moving through November of this year. Because if that happens, the world looks great for him. So any kind of uncertainty, any kind of instability, any kind of not anticipated calculations are going to be inconvenient politically for Xi Jinping. Why is that? Because it opens up the possibility of, oh, things are different now. We better rethink about what we're doing and how we're going to get there. So I guarantee that Xi Jinping has gamed it out and said, here's what we're going to be doing, and here's how this is going to play out. And he's got a strong set of preferences. And for that to take place and for that to play out, he needs things to go according to plan. He wants no possibility of an audible anytime between now and November. And in particular, there's a couple of key milestones or gates or checkpoints that he needs to be able to clear. The first one was this, Lianghui. Nothing unusual happening here, nothing important happening, move on. The second one is going to be the Beidaihe's conference this summer. Probably that's already signed, sealed, and delivered, but that's going to be the last big moment for a wild card to come into play. So what does that mean again for foreign policy? That is the biggest source. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that go wrong domestically too. But Xi Jinping thinks that he could control more of what goes wrong domestically. The international foreign policy environment is a place where he feels like he's less able to fully dictate the results. And so that's a bigger source of uncertainty. It's a bigger risk for him. And that's an important thing to think about. So when in doubt, he's going to want to try to establish stability out there. Interestingly, I thought the 7.1% growth in defense spending was kind of notable and interesting outcome coming out of here. And then they lowered down their assessment for what's going to be the targeted growth rate, which is to say this is the number you'll see reported eventually in terms of how China's economy is doing. They have a remarkable ability to hit their targets. And then the COVID lockdowns, most recently, Shanghai entering today into the second phase of the progressive lockdown because of COVID. Taking Shanghai's economy off the table and shutting it down, this is going to have very real and lasting implications to China. And this is important to understand. All right, so a bunch of economic headwinds. These are just some of the ones I could fit on the slide of things that could go wrong or things that they're facing, things that they're concerned about. And we'll get to some of these, I think, in the second panel as well. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the economic side. The 14th five-year plan, just some of the themes that are coming out of this. A lot of this in general is a function of the Xi Jinping's theory of victory, which is to say more control produces more stability, which keeps the party in power. That's the causal logic. And so a lot of the 14th five-year plan is designed to advance this common prosperity notion, that's been something that I think is kind of a bucket that Xi Jinping's put a lot of that constraining policies under. All right, so the strategic dimensions of trade, I won't spend too much time on this because I think the whole second panel will be talking about this, but I think it's important to contextualize China's view of the recent economic dynamics regionally and globally. So the trade war that started back in 2017, 2018 is really a big shock to China. It's sort of like, what? They're not really going to do that. They would never really seriously consider doing that, right? It challenged a lot of the fundamental assumptions that China had always taken for granted in the US-China relationship. The economics was always going to be there as a bedrock foundation beyond which there was not going to be friction in the relationship. Is always going to be there. And so all of those assumptions were challenged as a result of the trade war. So China had three things they wanted to do in response. Number one, fix this. So what do we got to do to renegotiate with the Americans? How do we get out of this? How do we fix this thing? They tried doing that. Number two, we're going to need someone else besides the United States because the United States is such an important source of aggregate demand for the Chinese export growth engine. And so they looked around and said, well, where else can we replace this huge demand signal to our export engine? And they said, no, there's only two places. There's Japan, which is why I'm here talking to you all today, and there's Europe, if you hope that Europe acts together as a cohesive unit, which they don't always do. neither one of them is good as a perfect replacement to the United States because they don't have the scale and they don't have the coherence that the United States has as a demand signal to China's export engine. They recognize that it's a second best option, but it's hedging your bets. And third, we'll make lemonade with the lemons we're given. We're going to advance this conversion from an export-oriented growth model towards a domestic consumption-oriented growth model, and we'll just kind of move that along with dual circulation and all kinds of other maneuvers we're going to try to do in this interim. They've been doing all three, and this I think is important to realize because this has an important strategic element to the U.S.-Japan alliance relationship, because Japan has a gravity temptation towards playing more strongly economically with China. So this is using 20 figures in a rough layout of the kinds, like decomposition of the nature of the trade between the United States and China. And I want to put this up here so you can understand the complementarity between the two economies, a huge imbalance. But basically, this number right here is what it means to China. $438 billion in 2020 in terms of what the United States brings to China. And that's the demand signal to the export engine. And these are finished goods, so it's not, to Hiroki's point about supply chains, we'll get into more detail, I think, this afternoon. It's not an entirely accurate picture because there's a lot of value added throughout the supply chain. But basically, this is what they're trying to replace. This is what needs to be replaced. This is what it looks like with Japan. Orders of magnitude smaller in terms of a good replacement to the United States capabilities, but structurally similar, kind of not too bad. It's an advanced OECD economy. It's got certain demographic properties to it. So it's not a bad substitute. It's the best they can get probably, but it's not a perfect substitute. And you do see this effort to kind of increase that economic relationship. I think this is going to continue to color that China-Japan relationship, this economics. So economics pulls China and Japan together. There's a lot of common ground there. There's a lot of complementarity historically between China and Japan on the economic front, but security concerns are pulling in the opposite direction. And this is the fundamental tension, I think, that governs the China-Japan relationship. It's this economics and security, and that's why it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of the new national security strategy coming out at the end of the year and how Japan's thinking about some of these kinds of questions. All right, so very quickly, because I think Diana already covered a lot of these things, but I think that we're at the moment now of and I put this in relative terms, but there's a shift taking place in Japan's paradigm, Japan's perspective, and I think that that this is a nice way to put it. This is a nice quote that I think kind of encapsulates this. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made all of those things that were put up in the first briefing, but all the things that Japan has done, they said, and they're still doing it. Russia's still invading. This is like kind of a moment for Japan's security thinking. And I think that's what's driving and motivating some of this recent development. So this is some of the things I won't dwell too much on this, but I'll call your attention to the parallels that Japan sees when it thinks about Ukraine and what that may look like and why this is particularly concerning to Japan. I also think that the opening up to Ukrainian refugees has been cast in terms of Taiwan and the ability to begin to build the capacity in Japan to accommodate these kinds of often very disruptive flows of displaced refugees. So this, I think, is kind of encapsulates it. Again, we'll see sort of where the appetite goes and what's permitted, both fiscally and politically in Japan. But the idea that Japan needs to implement a fundamental upgrade to its defense capabilities, I think, it's just a different approach. And this is, it's in some ways it's a continuation of Abe, but in some ways I think it's quite different. And I think it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out. So again, the 2x2. Here we've got dependence on the United States. There's reliance on the United States or independence. And on this one, it's use of force. So whether or not Japan is comfortable exercising force, constrain the use of force, be a little bit more liberal with your ability to use more regular force or military power in the region. I think we're moving this way. I think the political drift in Japan, the political winds are pulling the bubble cloud that we're somewhere over here. We're moving in this way, this direction over here. All right, so then they got a bunch of key events. I'm happy to get into this in the Q&A if people are interested, but I think this is part of a pattern. There's a whole series of things that have been going on in the last 3 years during COVID that are moving the United States in particular and Japan closer together. I think there's areas that we're finding that we could really have operationally significant cooperation that's changing the calculus of the security players in the region in a way that's meaningful, I think, to both nations. And I think this is a good thing. I think this is not bad. I think this is normal and natural, and I think it's a positive development, as long as we sort of, be realistic about it and to be able to keep it within bounds and keep it appropriate to the nature of the threats that are manifesting in the region. All right, so Japan's role in Asia, we talked a bit about this in terms of the Quad, and I just see the increasing institutionalization of these multilateral frameworks are a way that Japan is comfortable operating, and I think it to Diana's point, I think it does relieve the United States of having to always do everything everywhere in the region. And I think that's fitting American domestic political dynamics right now. I think India is an important piece of this equation. We'll sort of see how this plays out, but we talked a little bit about it at dinner last night. I think that the Ukraine response from China and the Ukraine response from India, although they might look superficially very similar, if you peel back the first layer, they end up looking quite different. And so it'll be interesting to kind of see how that ends up playing out. All right, so I will wrap up here. I think that right now there's kind of three big things that are driving Japan's security for the near future. Ukraine, how that plays out. It's a huge source of uncertainty and instability. Japan doesn't like that. North Korea says, hey, don't forget about us. We still have these missiles. Pay attention to me. Give me more money. I need to blackmail someone for you guys ignoring me. And then the PRC, who is watching all of this and thinking with an eye toward the future. And Japan is watching all three of these dynamics that are interrelated. They're connected together. Broadening the roles and missions, and then the United States and Japan coordinating on the Alliance for Regional Security. I think it does serve important functions for both nations. And I think it's a very comfortable paradigm and framework in which both countries are comfortable addressing these new and emerging threats and security concerns because it's a known institutional mechanism that allows them to be able to address them together. So I think these common threats often is the case in international relations. The common threats are going to continue to underpin strong alliance dynamics. I think it really clarifies for everybody why they're in an alliance when you get very clear and present dangers. And I think, interesting, this novel threat environment creates new opportunities potentially. I think Evan Medeiros recently called China's position pro-Russian neutrality, which I thought was a great phrase. And I think it kind of captures it. It's not China, and this is what's interesting. China thinks that it's neutral. Like China's telling itself and it tells its people, it says, hey, we're neutral. We're not in this. And I think that they think that they are, but I don't think they realize that everyone else looks at it and says, well, that's really pro-Russia, right? Like that neutrality is really a move to support Russia. And that'll probably get worked out at some point. Sometimes it takes a little while, bang your head against the wall a couple of times, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think for right now, it's convenient ambiguity. China hopes nobody's paying attention to China in all this. Pay attention to Russia. They're the bad guys. Ignore us over here. Don't pay any attention to us. And I think these domestic priorities are going to create a window of preferred stability in the region, which is essentially going to tolerate greater Japanese assertiveness on their security policy. And that's going to be the most controversial thing I'll kind of lob out there because it's like, but I'm an American and I'm in Texas, which makes me doubly bold at being able to kind of call a spade a spade. And so I'll put it out there because I think this is an interesting academic venue to discuss these kinds of things. And we're all grown-ups. And I think that that this is kind of the interesting, the final provocative note that I'll leave it on. So we'll end it there, and I'll look forward to Shaheen's comments.
Thank you, Shaheen.
Thank you, Will. That was a great presentation. I had a few questions about Japan and its security policy. We see that Japan, of course, remilitarized back, I believe, in 1954. But at that point, it had been subject to very strict limitations. Japan did not pursue any sort of WMDs, including nuclear weapons. Japan had very, its military spending was very limited. It did not develop many types of offensive weapons, including aircraft carriers, weapons that allow it to project power in distant parts of the world. Yet, Japan, over the past few decades, has moved in a different direction. There's been an increase in defense spending a little bit. Japan has actually been developing a program to build they're not called carriers. I believe Japan calls them something like special destroyers or helicopter carriers, but these helicopter carriers can be revamped, and you can in fact you can use them as aircraft carriers, as small aircraft carriers. Japan actually has expressed interest. They have two now. They've expressed interest to grow that force to 4 potential light aircraft carriers, you can call them. Japan has reinterpreted Article 9 to allow for collective self-defense. So Japan can fight for its allies if its allies if its allies might be defeated or threatened, and that might in turn pose some dangers to Japanese security. Japan has relaxed exports controls such that it can now export weapons and arms to other countries. And over the past, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people like Shinzo Abe have talked about openly, publicly about nuclear sharing, getting their hands on American nuclear weapons. And I was wondering, how is China going to respond to this move in Japanese policy? How are also other neighbors of Japan going to respond? Because I imagine there's still some fear about Japan moving in this direction. So that's the first question. I have one other question that I wanted to put to you. Let me just find that. I wrote it down. In the United States, there has been concerns about economic interdependence with China. Realists like John Mearsheimer, of course, have been very critical of US policy to engage China and to engage in economic interdependence because this makes us vulnerable. It gives the Chinese some degree of leverage over the United States. I was wondering if you could speak to the extent to which there is some fears about growing Japanese economic interdependence with China and what that might mean. You had showed a nice graphic of Japanese exports to China and Chinese exports to Japan. But is there a growing fear that this type of a trade relationship, while beneficial or mutually beneficial to both parties, can also be quite dangerous given the relationship between the two? And finally, I was wondering if you could talk about the issue and the dispute over Taiwan and how that factors into China-Japan relations, and whether that has put some strain on the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. So we would like to move to the discussion. Do you have any question or comments, thought you would like to put on the table? One question comes from David Kam online. It's such. Oh, so this is another question from Rai. So there are two questions. The first question is on the near future of energy policy changes. With the possible sale of Saudi Arabia oil to China using renminbi. Sorry. Or renminbi, the now apparent vulnerable supply from Russia and tapping into supply from less desirable nations like Iran and Venezuela, etc. How are these shifts in trading going to impact the world stage in terms of energy dependence and US dollars as world currency? Energy and currency. So another question from our colleague, Professor Lai Leong. Japan's security foreign policy approach vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. That is actually very important question because, well, for Japan, Southeast Asia is very important compared with the United States. Prime Minister Suga's first visit to foreign country after inauguration was Vietnam and Indonesia. And then also, it's also related to RCEP. But okay, so the vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, especially in the framework of ASEAN and ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, how is it evolving given the newer concerns with probably newer concerns highlighted by the panelists? Okay. Anybody else who wants to add the question or comments? I'd like to ask each panelist to respond to Shaheen's comments as well as questions raised by the participants, and well, selectively you can, because it takes like every probably question requires an hour. So starting with Dr. Nakabayashi, and then going to the order of the presentation, and then going to Diana, and then like Will. Nakabayashi Sensei, could you respond to some of the questions and comments?
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, I had a great joy listening to other panelists' presentations. Those are so exciting, and it's amazing that even without flying there, I could be here. And everybody gave great thoughts and facts. I know the time is running out pretty quickly. Therefore, I want to just comment on the questions and other points that you just raised, partially because it is so hard to talk about everything. First of all, the energy issue. Japan is really having a difficult time. Even renewable energy is not enough, of course not. And in Russia, Mitsui and Mitsubishi, those big corporations have invested so much in the Sakhalin area to cultivate LNG and send it to Japan. However, Shell and other England energy giants actually withdrew because of the war in Ukraine. Therefore, we are wondering what Japanese companies, corporations can do about it. One thing that is interesting is Japanese people tend to expect that the United States is so bossy and it tells Japanese government what to do. But this time, President Biden or Biden administration didn't tell Japan what to do about that kind of cooperation with Russia in terms of energy. Even Biden administration didn't tell Germany what to do about the existing imports from Russia, because President Biden is a person who claimed that America is back and not just pursuing its own interest, but to cooperate with allies. Therefore, Biden administration isn't really strict about banning Japanese imports from Russia. So I think some energy is coming from there still, but Japan is, I think, gradually committing to reduce its dependence, of course, on Russia, similar to European countries. Today, I think that was Mitsui announced that they would start maybe next year or so a new innovative energy source to use the difference of two different hues, I think, a temperature and generate electricity from there. And I think Japan needs to accelerate its innovative efforts to change its energy dependence from LNG and oil to renewable and maybe nuclear energy. Another thing is Iran. Of course, Japan likes Iran compared to the sentiment in the United States. Whenever the United States had, when President Trump gave such a difficult time to Iran, Japanese, I think, policymakers thought, why Americans hate Iranians like that? That I remember, I heard from many people in Japan. If the United States can find a better relationship with Iran, of course, it would help. However, if China takes Taiwan, the route to bring oil to Japan is going to be limited and or in danger. Overall, Japanese people are feeling so insecure because of the current situation, as Professor Norris just pointed out, that Japanese people are feeling insecure because the United Nations is not working as well as we expected. Interestingly, President Zelensky of Ukraine, when he gave his speech at Japanese members gathering, he pointed out that we need to not reform United Nations, but find a new tool that would work whenever China or Russia, those big powers, are waging any kind of wars. Japanese people couldn't agree more than that. It was such a great speech and effective, and that was true. So Japanese role should be something to contribute to creating something workable. However, Japanese people or the government even are not confident about taking such a leadership. Well, I have to say, talking from Japan, that Japanese people are not that confident, unfortunately. So I think self-confidence to be built within Japan is the first thing to pursue for Japan, I think. And the Kishida administration is, I think, pursuing the same foreign policy that former Prime Minister Abe actually successfully created, such as FOIP, like free and open Indo-Pacific, right? We call it FOIP, and Quad. Those kind of things are sort of created. The concepts are created by Abe administration. I think that this kind of foreign policy should be pursued by Kishida administration. However, he's not gonna favor former Prime Minister Abe's domestic policies. However, Kishida hasn't won huge, important national elections, such as general elections for big time. Therefore, his first hurdle is going to be this year's upper house election. If he can win the upper house election this July, he will have freedom of 3 years without any national elections. During these 3 years, I bet Prime Minister Kishida would pursue his own real freedom of policy making. For now, he is being so cautious, not risking anything before the election. However, after the election, he will have 3 years. Therefore, we will see true Kishida administration after that, and he will pursue his own foreign policy, of course, which shouldn't be too different, though, from Mr. Abe's. And at the same time, he will maybe shift his domestic policy pretty differently. That is a general expectation by the Japanese people. President Biden is doing pretty friendly and nicely. And Japanese people say that Kishida and Biden are sort of similar because both of them are pretty nice people. So we'll see whether they can get along and come up with a great, I think, friendship and cooperation. Another concern is South Korea. South Korea is so important for this region's national security. Therefore, the United States are expected to play a bigger role than currently, because North Korea is becoming aggressive. China is, of course, economically it is nice. Japan is having a close relationship with China. However, China is really flexing the muscle of military expansionism, which is making Japanese people so nervous. If you take a poll among Japanese people, its distrust against China is bigger, more huge, bigger than the people in the United States. Therefore, China's military expansionism is the problem. And South Korea and Japanese alliance is so important, or cooperation is so important. Therefore, the United States role is expected more than ever. There are lots of things that I want to talk. However, I should stop there. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakabayashi. I know that you are approaching to midnight. Thank you very much for commenting on. So now, Diana.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna do sort of a lightning round, I think. So in answering Shaheen's question on Ukraine and will this situation be like a 9/11 for the Biden administration? Yes. I mean, hopefully it won't last as long. I don't think we're going to be going to war with Ukraine anytime soon. But yes, that's the concern, that this would be something that would take our eye off of Asia and China, and something that we need to guard against. On the other hand, I do think that the administration's made a lot of effort to make the point that they're really focused on the region. And then on the Kuril Islands and Northern Territory, I think DC's position right now, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is to do nothing, right? We do not want to get into a territorial dispute, and a US submarine was seen allegedly by the Russians in the waters near the Kuril Islands. And, you know, the United States disavowed that, denied it, and I think that's basically US policy there. And then in terms of Japan's changing pacifist legacy, you asked me if China and North Korea or the United States kind of lessening its role in the region was to blame for this increase towards a more militaristic Japan. I think all of the above. I mean, I think Japan is just trying to live in its neighborhood, and to do so protecting itself. So I don't know that one is more important than the other. The energy and currency question is not something I'm an expert on, but I would also just add to my answer to Lai's question on Southeast Asia. I do think that, you know, that region is fundamentally important to the United States and to their free and open Indo-Pacific policy in the region. And so, you know, working with Southeast Asia is vitally important, and those nations, with ASEAN, with ARF, and continuing to grow that relationship. Thank you.
And well,
sure. Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'll just jump right in, and I will take that oil question. So I'll get to that one. So first, Shaheen's questions about how China responds to this growing activism on the part of Japan in the security domain, and the neighbors in particular. So China, I think, as I laid out, it's going to have a strong preference for stability. So I think it's actually going to do less than it might want to at least through November, and then they might be able to have a freer, then they may have a freer hand to do what they really want to do. But the neighbor's point is a good one, and I think it's a good one to always keep Japan's foreign policy. The ear needs to be highly attuned to it, and I'll say this: that it's always nice to be asked. So when Japan wants to play a bigger role in the region, Japan would find its role much more regionally supported if the region looks to Japan and says, hey, we could really use, I'll give you an example. The Philippines say, hey, we got these really big problems. Our Coast Guard cutters are nowhere up to snuff to be able to run toe-to-toe with the Chinese in the South China Sea. Japan says, oh, we can help. The Philippines says, great. And so that's a great example. So Japan's kind of asked and invited in. Everybody's happy with it. Nobody's like, oh my goodness, Japan's sending Coast Guards to the Philippines. So I think it's nice when you think about those dynamics. It's always nice to be asked. Countries don't always play by that rule, but I think it is a good one that kindergartners can help us learn from. The second one about economic interdependence with China, is it good or bad? I think that when you talk about China and Japan, you're talking about, I would say, probably the two most highly sensitive countries about security externalities when it comes to economic relationships. I mean, these are the two countries that have literally written the books on the relationship between economic interdependence and security and concerns and those kinds of concerns. So I'll begin that response by just calling attention to that idea. Obviously, in general, economic interdependence is going to serve as a mitigating force for peace in international relations under most circumstances. When you've got strategic distrust, economic interdependence itself will become limited as a function of both parties' distrust of the other's potential use of economic leverage against it. So those are kind of the preconditions on the relationship between economic interdependence and the propensity towards stability or not. It can obviously be leveraged once you have dependence, then it's a source of leverage. But both Japan and China were before the most recent events highly sensitive to these things, and I think are even more sensitive and more deliberate about those considerations and those potential vulnerabilities. So I think that'll have a self-governing element to it. In terms of Taiwan, speaking of sensitive things, this is something that's very sensitive to China. I think Japan recognizes that sensitivity, and Japan's very careful about what it does in that space vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so when Japan changes things, when it makes moves that are concerning Taiwan or related to Taiwan, Japan is not doing that by accident. They're not going to mistakenly adjust a perspective or a paradigm that involves a Taiwan scenario or a Taiwan contingency. That's my point, that this is a very deliberate response. And this gets to Shaheen's beginning comments that the 1954 treaty based remilitarization, as he put it, I don't think I would use that term, but a re-emergence of the Japanese security being in 1954 was happening in the shadow of the Korean War. And that's an important reality. And that's the same kind as when Japan's security was clearly implicated by the events in its immediate neighborhood surrounding it. And under those conditions, Japan says, are we doing everything we need to do? Do we need to be doing anything differently? And the United States is amenable to those conversations under those kinds of conditions. I think you have a similar moment today. So the last question about the oil and the renminbi internationalization, I think China, for the most part, would like nothing better than to diversify the international holdings of its partner nations. And if countries are willing to accept renminbi in exchange for oil, like Saudi Arabia, if that were to come to fruition, I think that China would be happy to do those kinds of things. You've already seen a lot of Chinese activism around currency swaps and sort of a creeping internationalization of the renminbi. But I say that reserve currencies are notoriously sticky. These things, there's a lot of boxes that China would need to check. And I'm not sure on its capital account liberalization agenda that China's very excited to do a lot of the things that it would probably need to do to really seriously displace the dollar as an international reserve currency or as a transacting currency in oil markets. That said, there is a deliberate effort to encourage Shanghai as a hub, as a global trading hub for energy markets. China is a huge global demand of energy, so there's a rationale to be had along the increasing internationalization of renminbi as a clearing currency for oil transactions. I think it's something to watch. Although this reserve currency is a very sticky phenomenon, it is also, in my opinion, a tipping point phenomenon, which is to say when it flips and when it's no longer the universal global reserve currency, when the dollar no longer enjoys that status, when it no longer, when the American government no longer has that seigniorage, it's going to come very fast. And it'll be, in my opinion, a very disruptive event, because it's going to, the fundamentals that would underpin that kind of a shift would have already been in place for a long time, and then you'd see the actual shift. And it'll have, so it's a tipping point phenomenon in the sense that it'll have long been, the writing will have long been on the wall way before it. And when it happens, it's going to be catalytic. And so that's something definitely to be aware of and to be on the lookout for. And I think every time we go to the Swift well, every time we decide, oh, we could put the clamps down and we could use our capability as a global reserve currency to bring pressure to bear, everybody in the world looks at that and says, okay, yep, noted, got that. So that all creates a receptive audience for alternatives, whether it's digital currency or the renminbi or who knows what else, some baskets or other SDRs, whatever that may be. If the United States overdraws on its privileged status of the dollar in the international system, it has a cumulative effect by encouraging the appetite for alternatives that are not seen as being capriciously vulnerable to the whims of any particular administration. So, all right, I will leave it at that.
Okay. Well, we are going over time, so we would like to. I'd like to finish the first panel here, and then moving to the second panel. So we will take like we are a little bit like going like a little bit late behind the schedule. So the next panel will start at 10:05, and so we will have like 5 minutes, and then like coffee and pastry is still available. But please, before closing, please join me for thanking the panelists, the great panelists of the panel one. Okay. We are resuming the second panel. Second panel is an economic panel. And we start with Christy Govell from German Marshall Foundation, USA. And she's a political economist, expertise on Japan. And she talks about both the security. She is an expert of both security and economy. And then today talks about security and economy and the new concept called the economic security in the context of US-Japan economic relations. Christy, please join me for welcoming Dr. Christy Govell.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor to be speaking on such a distinguished panel. So it's a nice transition from the security panel actually to talk about economic security. And when I was looking at the description of the project that we're all here to discuss today, you know, the questions are really timely and important. So basically, what has pushed Japan to step up as a new leader in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific order? And what implications does Japan's new role have for other Asian countries? As well as for US-Japan relations. So my focus today, as Hiroki said, it would be on economic security, which I'll talk about exactly what that might be in a moment. But you know, I think it's clear, even from the presentations we've already had today, that Japan has long been a leader in thinking about things like economic statecraft and economic security, which basically entail an expansive view of the utility of economics for foreign policy and the interrelationship between economics and security and energy and all sorts of things, which we've already heard about. So in terms of what this means for other countries and for US-Japan relations, you know, I think that Japan really can serve as an instructive example of and partner for potential policy solutions to economic security problems. And in some cases, it might offer a bit of a cautionary tale about the limits of government action to solve some of these problems and some of the challenges that we might encounter going forward. So just to start out, I would say that Japan sees itself very much as being on the front lines of the rise of China. And when we talk about things like economic coercion, which is, a really common topic of discussion these days, Japan sees itself as one of the earliest experiencers of this in its, recent incarnation, particularly thinking back to 2010 with an incident around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which resulted in China banning the export of rare earths to Japan, which, was a huge problem because Japan was highly dependent on this. And it really, is an example of the vulnerabilities of the kinds of interdependence that it had. And Japan, of course, was aware of this much beforehand, but over time, Japan's understanding has become closer to that of other countries, including the US, due to several factors. One is definitely that these concerns about Chinese economic dominance and its use of economic tools to punish others have become much more common. So what Japan went through in 2010, for example, has happened to South Korea after the deployment of THAAD. It's happened to Lithuania. So many other countries have, been awakened to the vulnerabilities that underlie this economic interdependence, this kind of darker story of globalization. So it doesn't just ameliorate tensions, but in fact, it can be used as a punitive tool as well. I think another factor is changes in technology that have more highlighted the links between the technology and security. So things like dual-use technologies that have military and civilian applications, as well as 5G communication technologies that have security implications. And then, of course, the pandemic has also highlighted the vulnerabilities that all countries face due to interdependence and the fragilities of the global economy, which then have even more been highlighted by the war in Ukraine. So really, these things are on the minds of countries everywhere. And economic security is something that we talk about, all the time in DC and elsewhere now. So, one of the results of this is that there has been a great deal of alignment of interests between the US and Japan in the present moment, as both seek to work independently as individual countries, and then also with each other and other like-minded partners to try to reduce their vulnerability to these economic security risks. And so, at this present moment, the striking alignment in interests means that, it's really at the step where they're trying to move from interest to actions. So how will they move past sort of this admiring the problem phase, where we all understand that there are so many issues with economic security, to really deal with them, and how quickly and effectively can these countries do so? So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now involves basically the attempts by Japan and other countries to effectively develop toolkits to more effectively cope with these kinds of risks and coercion, and to more effectively deploy what people call economic statecraft, which could be basically defined as the use of economic tools for non-economic purposes. And so you can think of these different, tools. Some are more defensive to protect you from risk. Some are more proactive to cultivate a favorable environment. And the tools that you're talking about are things like trade flows, investment, sanctions, all kinds, tourism, financial policy. All of these things can be either used to cultivate relationships or weaponized. So it really is a, very complex and dynamic environment. So I would note that, we talk about economic security a lot, but it really has no agreed upon definition. And this is not like just an academic issue. It's really an important one. So basically, although countries have converged upon this, understanding that it's important, this economic security thing, it's actually being actively defined by governments and companies and scholars all around the world. I would say in its most common usage, it basically reflects a recognition that economics and security are intertwined, and that you need to protect your prosperity or perhaps promote resilience, or at least avoid being economically vulnerable or coerced by others. But for some countries, it's actually much more active. Like if you look at the US Department of Defense's definition of economic security, it actually involves things like shaping international interests to American liking and possessing material resources to fend off non-economic challenges, which is much more like activist, actually, right? So the reason that the definitions are important is because, agreeing on sort of the problem set is good, but then moving to solutions means that you have to have more of a cohesive understanding of exactly what you're talking about. And I think that a lot of people worry that economic security is actually just another way to say protectionism. It's another way to promote policies that basically shore up your domestic economy and, discriminate against others in ways that you can justify through security things. But, I think a lot of that anxiety is due to this ambiguity and this, question about what exactly people are talking about, because the definition that you have actually, clearly affects the kind of policy solutions that you have. So I think one of my other panelists is going to talk about domestic tools. So I won't talk about them too much. But, in order to understand what Japan is doing, which I said can serve as sort of an instructive example, Japan, like the US, like others, is trying to both strengthen itself domestically to protect against threats, to strengthen its industries. And so we've seen all of these different changes like new legislation, et cetera. And then outwardly, it's trying to form cooperative relationships with countries like the US and pursue these kinds of policies. So I'm happy to talk about things like the legislation or the new Minister for Economic Security or things like that in the question and answer period if people are interested. But in the interest of deconflicting panelist comments, I will just move on to the outward-looking bits. But I'll say on the domestic bits, I think all of the conversations that we've been having really highlight the interconnectedness of different issues and the ways that domestic and international issues are really connected. So when Japan does things domestically, it's not just domestic. And there's a lot of questions about how you harmonize domestic policies across borders with things that are happening similarly in Europe or the US or elsewhere. So, but if we look at only kind of outward facing efforts, we can think about them perhaps as more unilateral efforts versus bilateral efforts versus minilateral ones. And so certainly Japan has been doing a lot of things individually that resemble what we hear talked about in the US. So they're trying to promote onshoring, for example, trying to encourage companies to come back. And they've been doing this for quite some time, and they continue to offer, for example, subsidies to Japanese companies to encourage them to move their plants from China back to Japan or perhaps to ASEAN countries, which are less risky. I would just note that this is one of the areas where I think that Japan's experiences are sort of a cautionary tale of the limitations of these policies, because it is, in fact, very difficult to get companies to move, and the ones that have diversified have often done so for economic reasons, like rising wages in China, other kinds of economic conditions, et cetera. But Japanese companies do continue to consider China to be a top investment destination, despite these policies, despite the risks. But nonetheless, the Japanese government has been very active in doing these policies basically for the last 10 years, and it continues to ramp them up. And so then when we think about, more bilateral things, again, focusing on the US and Japan, because that's our conversation today, this is where, for example, with supply chains, the conversation moves to things like ally shoring or friend shoring, for example, and, ways that the US and Japan can address shared concerns, again, often prompted by China, but not exclusively related to that. So, over the last couple of years, for example, we've seen a lot of initiatives. For example, in 2021, in April, the US and Japan established the CORE partnership, the US-Japan Competitiveness and Resilience Partnership, which has a lot of issues under it, including competitiveness on innovation, so things like 5G, ICT standards, supply chain cooperation, biotech, connectivity, for example. And there are also portions of health and climate that also relate to security. So, you see this wide basket of issues that have been identified for cooperation and that will be spun out into potential implementation. More at the private sector facing level, METI and the Department of Commerce established something called the US-Japan Commercial Industrial Partnership, whose activities basically try to promote private sector cooperation and investment in both countries. And again, you see common themes like supply chains for semiconductors, 5G, other industries, among other things. And then we saw in January the launch of an economic 2+2 dialogue, which will be led by the Secretaries of Commerce and State and their counterparts in Japan. And this is again an effort to kind of harmonize these domestic things that I alluded to, but also their bilateral and regional initiatives. So there's a lot of dynamism again, in this alignment of interests in the US and Japan, and a lot of efforts to talk about things. But I think also still a lot of work to be done in trying to identify the specific solutions and how to move forward. And of course, with the knowledge that government is only a piece of it, and really, companies and private sector actors are a big part of the story of economic security. So really working with them and finding ways to, engage in dialogue and find meaningful solutions to, companies' problems is a huge challenge. But I think that then if we go beyond bilaterally, which is, a very common mode of discussion in US-Japan, circles, I think it's also interesting that US-Japan cooperation has really become a central plank of minilateral cooperation in the region. So it's not just about the US and Japan, but it's about the US-Japan partnership at the core of broader regional cooperation. So if we talk about the Quad, for example, was mentioned in the first panel. And, you know, a lot of its agenda that's taken up has actually been non-military. It's been economic. It's been things like climate change and health. And so, you know, when we talk about critical and emerging technologies or semiconductor supply chain initiative and things like this, you know, there's a lot of clear harmony between what the US and Japan are doing and what they're trying to do in the Quad. And that, you know, has a certain synergy and a supporting element to it. Also, infrastructure investment has been a focus in the region. It's a strength of Japan's. Japan has, of course, been investing and supporting through its official development assistance, infrastructure development in the region for decades. And, you know, as concerns have risen about China's Belt and Road Initiative and some of the security and political risks associated with that, you know, the US and Japan have really tried to work with other countries like Australia, for example, to promote high standards infrastructure. Again, you know, there's the beginnings of this story, but there is a lot of questions about how it moves forward. So, for example, with the Blue Dot Network, which is something that was set up by the US, Japan, and Australia to basically create a mechanism that certifies projects to encourage private investment in infrastructure. You know, not many projects really have gone through, or any projects really, but you know, these things are the beginning of setting up a framework, and really it's interesting to see how the US and Japan are at the core of that. It also is echoed in things like APEC's recent plan of action in 2021 also sets promotion of resilient supply chains, for example, as an objective. So there's all these new mechanisms, and it's really interesting to note that the US and Japan and that alignment of interests, you know, is consistent through all of them. Although, as I said, the solutions I think are difficult to develop because of these things. So, you know, just to kind of wrap up and think about the ways that we can perhaps use Japan's experience so far and its, you know, nascent initiatives with the US to think about lessons or tensions that need to be balanced. I think that, you know, what countries are doing now to deal with economic security, they're trying to balance basically a desire to strengthen their domestic economies with a desire and a need to maintain openness and cooperate. And that's very challenging for all of them. And it really goes to this question of whether, you know, economic security is really about protection or this kind of thing. What does resilience really mean? I think another tension is, you know, the appropriate role for the government versus the private sector. A lot of the things I talked about are, you know, government initiatives, but then, you know, in order to actually implement meaningful change, the question is, you know, does the private sector respond to the incentives or to the deterrents that you're putting on them? And does it, you know, in fact solve the vulnerability or at least mitigate against the risks that you're trying to mitigate against? And I think that's difficult. And, you know, that consultation between the two sides and trying to craft solutions is very tricky indeed. And then I think the last thing I would end with is just that, of course, there is a lot that's positive with this alignment between the US and Japan. And in fact, they've been inspired and driven to cooperate by the challenges they face, basically. But they're also normal economic competitors, you know, and have many companies that compete very normally in healthy times. So I think, you know, there's a question about how you coordinate and how you cooperate and reduce and mitigate against risks, while also leaving that room for normal economic competition. And at what point, you know, it makes sense to, you know, basically let the markets do what they do, and at what point the government really can make a difference. So I think there is these tensions are, you know, always going to be there. You can find different sort of equilibria at which to solve them. And so I don't think they're unsolvable, but it is tricky to get that balance. And every country might not choose the same solution. So I think that is sort of the task in implementation and thinking about not only creating the tools, but then moving forward and using them. So I'll stop there.
Now, I'd like to bring our discussant, Dr. Mike Strauss of the Texas Christian University. He is an expert of Japanese politics. At the same time, especially he is an expert of the migration of the Japanese political economy. So, Michael, brief comments and then raising questions, and then I move to next panelist.
Thanks so much, Hiroki, and thanks, Dr. Govilla, for a very interesting presentation. I'm just going to ask two questions briefly, and then pass it on to to Dr. Park. So my first question has to do with, if we think about just stepping back and thinking about the notion of economic security in a broad sense, when we think about the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Trade Organization that are established after World War II, based on the idea of the theory of comparative advantage, and essentially the idea that trade is always, and market expansion is always beneficial and leads to like a certain spread of ideas and stuff like that, is the notion of economic security sort of a recognition of the failure of that idea in some way, that maybe these ideas didn't spread, or democratic ideas didn't spread along with trade, so we have to retrench it and come up with another solution? But more specifically, in your presentation, I was thinking specifically about some of the challenges that Japan and many other countries are facing stemming from aging societies. And then Japan is sort of the most extreme example. And so if we think about some of the solutions to aging societies that are being discussed in Japan and elsewhere, one of the big ones is automation. But of course, automation, there's value chain and supply chain things with where the robots come from, and then also who's programming them and stuff like that. And there are, I think, economic security challenges there. And then also immigration is another challenge, something that I know a lot about. So where there are also sometimes said to be security challenges related to that. So I guess I'd like to hear about some of the economic security solutions specifically related to those two kinds of issues. But thank you very much for an interesting talk.
I'm happy to introduce, I'm delighted to introduce next speaker, Dr. Kathleen Ibata-Arens, and she's talking about U.S. economic relations, but focusing on a pandemic. And she's the author of the most recent book about pandemic, focusing on comparing China, Japan, and India. She has been working on, well, I would say like a political economy of the industrial policy, especially pharmaceutical industries, for a long time. Please join me for welcoming Dr. Ibata-Arens.
Sure.
No, this one is not.
Feel bad, Christy had this great extemporaneous interactive talk, and I have prepared remarks with death by PowerPoint. I terribly apologize. I've been doing triple duty this morning, well, yesterday morning and this morning, and right after this panel, I have to get back on a Zoom because we are trying very hard to hire a new president for my university. Because the current one is retiring in 2 months, so I have very boring prepared remarks for my book. He told me I could talk about the book if I came today, so that's what I'm doing. But it is contextualized within two huge problems facing Japan right now. One is the existential threat of future pandemic threats, given the fact that we already witnessed what happened when the global supply chain was dislodged, not to mention the fact that most countries depend upon APIs, which is called active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. And so the fact that the global supply chain was completely disrupted really got Japanese policymakers, American policymakers, and European policymakers thinking that there need to be some solutions. But I'm happy to say that Japan has had some things underway for a while. And so, let me see. So I'm a Mac user. How do I do slideshow? Okay. What's going on? There we go. So we were talking at dinner last night, and I didn't know we were supposed to have 10 minutes of prepared remarks. So I sort of threw this together last night at 1 a.m. or this morning at 1 a.m., managed to email it, and So here we go. I'd like to say good morning and thank you to our host. I had a really interesting talk from the ambassador last night, and that was actually my question that I asked the ambassador relates to what I'm going to share with you today. So this talk comes from two books. This book, Pandemic Medicine, actually follows from my 2019 Stanford University Press book, Beyond Techno-Nationalism, Biomedical Innovation Entrepreneurship in Asia, which is more within the techno-nationalism, as you can see from the title, and economic security literature, whereas my most recent book is more grounded within human health and the health of our planet. And so each country's national security is really dependent on the ability to keep its citizens healthy, in addition to all of these sort of traditional ways we measure national security. So pandemic medicine, while the previous book analyzed national government policy and entrepreneurial firm level strategy and how governments can help stimulate innovation and entrepreneurships in products for human health, this book, Pandemic Medicine, published last year, analyzes the possibilities for a more open innovation system at a global level, our global innovation system for all people. In 2016, I was in India interviewing biopharmaceutical scientists and entrepreneurs for my 2019 book. You probably know this history, but I was quite shocked to learn that the pharmaceutical company Pfizer had essentially created the World Trade Organization agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights and used that TRIPS agreement, in fact, several years later after its foundation, to try to sue Nelson Mandela for his attempts to use TRIPS flexibilities in order to access Indian biopharmaceutical treatments for HIV/AIDS. So why did Pfizer do this? Target Nelson Mandela, and also through the TRIPS agreement, be able to solidify a certain structure to the intellectual property rights regime, which is all about protecting monopoly patents for their drugs. So we have the pharmaceutical lobby and bringing great therapies and great drugs to humanity, but telling us that without patents, there would be no new innovative medicines. This isn't true. Industry data shows that more than 75% of research and development spending actually goes into what is called evergreening patents. That is, patents on minuscule molecular level tweaks to existing drugs. So this is a not very innovative innovation system if you think about it. And so how does it sustain? Well, as you might already be guessing, bless you, it has a lot to do with the power of the global pharmaceutical lobby in Washington, D.C. and in Europe. And so $309 million by 2020 was spent to really keep this control on the patent-centric global IPR system. And we could talk about what are patents, why are they important for other technologies in the Q&A. But if we take a look at Pfizer, for example, and as I just said, did create the WTO TRIPS Accord, it reported more than $11 billion in COVID-19 vaccine revenue in just the first 6 months of 2021. So it need not be said that we know that Pfizer actually did not invent the COVID vaccine. It just deployed it at scale, right? Who invented it? A small biopharmaceutical startup in Germany, BioNTech. And those discoveries were based, in fact, on investments made by the German government and therefore the German taxpayer. But if we take a look back in the historical context, how did we get here to where we are in the global pharmaceutical industry, where we have this sort of patent-centric IPR regime? If we take a look back in the course of medical discoveries in the 20th century, actually, these discoveries were more often than not shared in the public commons, and the inventors of them have never sought to patent them. These, in fact, included the first antibiotic penicillin, as well as insulin, a natural biologic which was discovered in 1921. The doctors and scientists seeking to save the lives of patients suffering from diabetes obtained a patent on insulin, but immediately sold it for mere $1 to the University of Toronto, saying, "Insulin belongs to the world." These scientists and innovators were hoping that this move, basically handing it over to the university, would ensure that this life-saving discovery would be held inside the public commons, shared by all. Unfortunately, pharmaceutical companies, including Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, hopefully they're not sponsors of this conference, have obtained incremental process patents over a century ago, right? This innovation was discovered over 100 years ago, and they still, in 2022, command 90% of the global market for insulin. These pharma firms have, since insulin's discovery nearly 100 years ago, have been able to capture what I called these evergreening patents. These are also called pejoratively Me Too drugs, since they have been incremental modifications of the original insulin that had been shared as a public good. Monopoly profits in the hundreds of billions of dollars to these companies have followed. Meanwhile, as we know, in the developing world, we have millions and millions of young people who cannot access essential medicines because they just can't afford to buy them. So even today, over a century ago, patented insulin is a major source of revenue for what is called big pharma. Again, there was money to be made, monopoly profits to be gained. But what I really want to talk about today is this existential threat to humanity, to human health. Because what we really have right now is potentially life-saving natural biologics, such as insulin, that are disappearing due to the biodiversity loss, but also the biopiracy, just as we are entering what I would call an age of pandemics. Why is it fair to say that we are in an age of pandemics? Because the frequency and severity of viral disease spreading across borders is on the rise. Scientists, in fact, anticipate that these outbreaks will continue to worsen due to the loss of biodiversity that is bringing human population in close proximity to the wild animals and dangerous microbes that harbor disease, hence COVID and the coronavirus. So for example, since 2012 alone, at least 5 viral diseases have reached epidemic proportions. The current novel coronavirus is just the latest mutation, more and more on the horizon, and not just viral disease, bacterial infection, fungi. Anybody who has had an older relative in the hospital, you have to worry about, non-treatable MRSA, which can kill your elderly relative because it's such a powerful bacterial infection that our current antibiotics are unable to cure. So taking a look at this global context, so rather than have an open innovation commons, inclusive, for example, of stakeholders with a sense of what I would say noblesse oblige, we have a system that has proven itself woefully unprepared in the current pandemic, fragmented and siloed. Instead of coordinate efforts under an inclusive architecture of open innovation, we instead have what I see as crisis innovation, trying to bring diagnostics and treatments to patients. And again, this is still affecting, we are triple vaxxed here in the developed world, but the entire global south has barely been able to access one jab. So these national attempts have been hampered by conflicting national and state policies and varying levels of competency in national leadership and international cooperation. And this is where people have critiqued Japan, but in fact, I would argue that Japan has been somewhere in the middle of the playing field in terms of mitigation and not doing anything at all to protect their population. I mean, part of the reason why none of us can go to Japan is because the government is being very judicious about exposing the populace to this virus. But again, based upon the research that I did in China, India, and Japan, I find that emergent organizations in these countries, including certain public-private partnerships, are doing their part, in fact, to foster innovation that is open and inclusive while encouraging sharing in a meso-level commons. COVID-19 is the second SARS virus. The first hit China in 2002. At the time, the spread was checked because scientists were able to map the genomic structure of the virus quickly, having already been collaborating on the Human Genome Project. The Human Genome Project brought together researchers from all over the world, transcending national and institutional boundaries with a common goal of mapping the entire human genome. The innovation architecture of the HDP can be described as an open innovation commons. A commons is a space where public good can be shared by all. An innovation commons is a space where new ideas, novel discoveries are shared as a public good. New drug discovery for essential medicines is an issue area that illuminates the normative significance and moral economy of the commons. Data indicates that natural medicines, these biologics that I talked about earlier, and the knowledge about them held in the innovation commons have contributed to more than half of the patented drugs currently on the market. 4 existing drugs have been from these natural plant, animal, and other organic chemical compounds. Other estimates put this as close to 70%, 70 of all patented drugs derived from these materials and knowledge. So taking a look at the precursor epidemic of SARS in 2002, it was contained as an epidemic. It never became a pandemic. Hospitals in mainland China, in Guangzhou and Guangdong province in particular, included natural, non-synthetic, plant-based biological medicines in the treatment course. Scientists and policymakers found subsequently that the mortality and morbidity rate in areas treating patients with natural, sometimes called traditional medicine, was significantly better than regions that did not. Natural medicines are not patented. In fact, it used to be under international patent law, you could not patent nature. Patents were never granted on living things. For example, Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, when asked in 1954 why he did not seek a patent for his invention, responded, "Can you patent the sun?" Flash forward to SARS-2 or COVID-19, and we have a global innovation system that is fragmented by a patent-centric intellectual property rights regime that discourages sharing. Meanwhile, most of the world's population, 85% according to the World Health Organization, depends on natural medicines for their basic healthcare needs. These issue areas are complex and interconnected, as this Venn diagram shows, and if we were in class, I'd break you up into little working groups, and we would talk about each of these Venns and where the interstices of overlap are, but I'm sure, well, the students might have fun with that, but professors are notoriously bad students. Natural medicines, the foundation of all medicines, depend on plant genetic biodiversity. That's where we're getting into the health of our planet now. If most of humanity depends on these natural biological materials for their basic healthcare, then it makes sense that the innovations for new drugs should be inclusive of the ways in which natural medicine has in fact been shared in the innovation commons, what I call an open innovation sandbox. What we have now, unfortunately, is a system of silos, enclosing the innovation commons for medicine discovery. Patenting the natural biologic world enriches pharmaceutical companies while human health suffers. So I know that I spent most of this time framing the issues in the global and intellectual property rights regime structure, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the findings that from China, India, and Japan, but specifically Japan, because sometimes these PPPs, private-public partnerships, or public-private partnerships, either way, have had contentious relationships with their national governments. And this is not the case in Japan, in fact, unlike other places, such as what's been happening in India and China, but we could talk about that in the Q&A. So the case studies of the book have really been talking about the way we can innovate that will bring profit to private organizations and companies, but also be able to work collaboratively to share the innovations. Should I start?
Yeah, the video, yes, is for some reason also.
Trying to press start my video, but it's not working.
Okay, no, it's
Okay, all right. So a pattern, whoops, what happened to that? Wrong one. Okay, so a pattern emerges in the way these organizations structure their innovation activities. I call them innovation sandboxes and pools. As the stylistic graph shows, sandboxes provide a structure or structured play to coax participants, be they national governments, firms, or foundations, to collaborate in an approximation of an open innovation commons in the aim of novel medicinal discoveries. Intellectual property pools over here in the lower right hand side of the matrix are typically pools of patents or other compound libraries, and are also a meso step or approach towards greater sharing across institutional boundaries. And we have silos over here, which is the current evergreen system. And what's going on in China is more like a cage, but we won't talk about that right now. But framing the analysis of what's going on in terms of protecting human health, in terms of this typology matrix, typical in political science literature, my political science colleagues are like, oh, we've seen this before. But in any case, it helps to situate your cases along the Y and X axis. You can use a variety of measures in order to plug in or populate these quadrants here. High to low novelty and low to high openness. So it's not only about removing the fences around the sandbox of innovative activity, but also inviting a greater breadth of stakeholders to play in it, hence the PPP model in use in Japan. That is, the global IPR regime remains firmly in the grip of the WTO TRIPS. In turn, behind TRIPS are pharmaceutical and other companies with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The last thing they want is transformational and inclusive change. And I'm not talking about revolution here. I'm talking about, a better way to innovate so that those discoveries reach more patients. Nor do they want to see a push for a sui generis intellectual property rights regime, as China has indicated it might seek through its proactive protection of its vast natural medicine corpus. And I've been collecting data on a subsequent project, and it's pretty shocking, some of the findings that I'm seeing in terms of the patenting patterns by China. In certain biologicals, the inventors are ceding their rights to their invention to the Chinese state. So it's actually the Chinese state that is patenting these biological materials. Again, under the current structure of the global IPR regime, they're just playing by the rules, right? So if we take a look at various levels, and I'm not going to get too into this because I think I might be already over time. But if we take a look at structures of innovation systems, there are a number of ways to study innovation within the intellectual property rights system we have, to look at it in terms of its exclusivity, but also the potential for inclusivity. So if we take a look at a few of these cases at the national private industry nexus in Asia, we could see some of this innovative activities. So let me just take a look at in Japan. One includes the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, GHIT as it's called. It's a partnership between the national government in Japan, but also venture capital firms, private investors, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, and the United Nations Development Program. And its aim is to discover new essential medicines for neglected tropical diseases called NTDs. Its first round of investments was launched in April 2013. As of the third quarter 2021, several promising diagnostics and therapies are in the pipeline for malaria, tuberculosis, and also dengue fever, which is actually a pretty serious disease in the global south. It causes encephalitis and death if untreated. A pediatric drug, for example, one of the discoveries for treating the deadly parasitic infection schistosomiasis. It's a pretty serious one as well. So GHIT has this one in stage 3 clinical trials. So it's almost ready to deploy within patient communities. Another innovation in Japan, sponsored by the Takeda. So pharmaceutical companies are not all bad. So this one is sponsored by Takeda Pharmaceutical, and it's called the Takeda Garden for Medicinal Plant Conservation. It's nestled in the northern mountains of Kyoto. While this Takeda Kyoto Garden functions primarily as a demonstration garden for local schools and universities, including pharmacists in training, it also conserves the medicinal plant biodiversity through its seed and rhizome bank, and in fact has a collaborative network across the world in terms of preserving these biological materials for future research purposes. But the reason Takeda Pharmaceutical is noteworthy is because this project is decoupled from the profit of the company. It's almost 0.1% of its revenues are even related to these biologicals, even though Takeda actually started as a seller of kamboyaku, which is a natural Chinese medicine. So Japan's approaches to our global innovation commons are, in fact, not surprisingly, pragmatic. As such, Japan remains mostly in the quadrant of the pools of the TISA, the typology of innovation system architectures, as I call it, through its quasi-open sharing of existing discoveries and making incremental innovations to current technologies. So I'd be happy to discuss these and the other cases in the Q&A, and I'm so excited to hear that Michael was the discussant because I know he's an expert in many of these things. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation, Dr. Ibaterens. So I'm just going to ask 3 questions right now in the interest of time. although I could ask many more. So the first is, you noted that the strength of the pharmaceutical industries is really related to their power and influence in Washington, D.C. And I'm wondering if it perhaps also could be linked to the power of an idea that essentially the private sector just does things better than the government. And like, that's an idea, I mean, trade going back to the Reagan Revolution and stuff like that, that's, especially in the American context, is really powerful. And I think a lot of people believe that. So I wonder if it's not just necessarily sort of backroom peddling, but just a lot of people just think private companies do things better. And if that's the context, that a lot of people believe essentially that those companies do things better, then does that change the way that we should address the abuses of those companies? And then the second question is, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the Japanese model of COVID response, because it's really interesting and puzzling, because there was very little that they did in terms of mandates, right? There were no mask mandates. There were a few shutdowns. That you mentioned the immigration restrictions, and I, of course, I'm as an immigration scholar, I'm very aware of those, but there were no restrictions or limited restriction on Japanese people moving in and out of Japan. So they could still sort of bring COVID if they wanted to, and yet the cases were really low and the deaths were really low too. So what do you think about that? And then my third question has to do with, I guess your big picture take on what governments should be doing to better prepare for and respond to pandemics, given everything you laid out. But thank you for a really interesting presentation.
Thank you. The next speaker is Jean Park, professor of Royal Marymount University, and you are now department chair. Unfortunately. Well, Japanese とご苦労様です。So you have to do a lot of things. So he's talking about the linkage between the domestic politics and the foreign policy making, focusing on the Japanese foreign economic policy. So Jean, please join me for welcoming.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's my second time and first flight since COVID and first in-person presentation. So it's a treat to be part of this excellent panel. And thanks to Hiroki for the invitation. And I also like to thank Christy, who helped deconflict so we don't overlap too much in our comments. Last night, I asked her, what are you speaking about? She said, economic security. I said, oh, that's what I was going to speak about. There's going to be some overlap, but with some different nuances. So basically, I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that Christy laid out in terms of really looking at the U.S.-Japan relationship, also looking at their foreign economic policies. And the story is one of really, I think, convergence by and large. And the convergence has been really quite impressive given the number of changes and shocks and the events that we've had over the last several decades. And I think there's also a positive benefit of that convergence, which is it amplifies the messages and the policies and the impact of the policies. And it also helps push things up to the mini-lateral level that Christy was pointing out to. But in terms of the big shocks, I think most obvious one is the rise of a stronger and more assertive China, right? One that's deeply interdependent with the world. The second is the shift in U.S. foreign policy that began with President Trump and the rise of economic nationalism, America First agenda. And the third is, of course, the global pandemic. And then now we are experiencing the war in Ukraine and the tragic events there. Arguably, I think other than U.S. economic nationalism, all of these events actually have produced policies on the part of the U.S. and Japan that have actually converged. The responses have been similar in part because the interests have been similar. And again, with I think some positive spillover effects. Thinking about the rise of China, that's clearly produced this new turn towards concern about economic security. And we've seen this on many dimensions, and Christy mentioned them, but I'll kind of go over a few of these. Trying to reduce dependence on Chinese suppliers. And here Japan was, I think, ahead of the game because they experienced coercion, right, over the banning of exports of rare earth metals to Japan. And I think Japan's had some degree of success in diversifying away from Chinese dependence for these rare earth metals. More scrutiny of foreign investment, that's clearly happening on the US government side, as well as the Japanese government side. Control of technology exports, making sure that sensitive technologies, especially dual-use technologies, are not exported from each country to China in particular. Hardening of cybersecurity, promoting competitiveness with China, and I think Christy mentioned the core partnership, which is also, I think, a bilateral effort towards that goal. And also coming up ways to counterbalance China's influence through its economic diplomacy, in particular the Belt and Road Initiative, right, which is a massive infrastructure investment program led by the Chinese in order to promote interconnectedness across the Asian Peninsula, across Southeast Asia, and all the way through to Europe, right? That some worry will lead to greater Chinese influence. Japan, again, played a key leadership role promoting the idea of quality infrastructure through their partnership for quality infrastructure as a kind of counter to Belt and Road investments, with the idea that there would be higher standards, greater transparency, really better accounting to ensure that many of these projects don't lead to debt trap diplomacy, which China has been accused of. And that, in turn, idea, I think, fed up. It was taken up by the OECD. And Christy also mentioned the Blue Dot Network as well. So again, we're seeing similar policies, and in some cases, Japan and the US influencing each other. And again, I think with a great magnifying effect. So that's all been extremely, I think, productive. The other event that I mentioned, the pandemic, I think really pushed forward supply chain resilience. Japan has innovated in having a policy to, quote, onshore production, either move production from China back to Japan or to Southeast Asia. And the US has done that as well. Of course, the pandemic also provided some pretext for greater supply chain diversification in the context of a rising China. So these are not kind of mutually exclusive motivations. And then finally, with the war on Ukraine, or excuse me, the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen, again, alignment of policies. Japan has followed the sanctions regime that the US is imposing, as well as the EU. And I think also for the first time, we're beginning to see a serious rethink in Japan about its energy policy and dependence on Russian oil. Prior, it was clear that Abe was trying to have a kind of peace treaty with Russia, and I think was looking potentially at Russia as a security partner, actually, to counterbalance against China. So with Ukraine, I think we've seen greater alignment of interests and policies. So despite this kind of very positive story, I think there are a few areas where we see some degree of divergence, right? Interests don't always necessarily lead to policies. There's also domestic politics and different structural situations that affect a country's foreign policies. And in some areas, there are fissures. And I'm going to point out two. One is trade, and the other is economic relations with China, how to approach China. On trade, it's very interesting because we've seen a flip, right? Japan was always seen as the country that had the strong agricultural lobby, that was really kind of reticent in pushing forward trade deals. It seemed to kind of be caught in its kind of, basically domestic politics from preventing it from moving forward. And the US was kind of coaxing, I think, trade along, but it seems like the positions have flipped to some extent. The US under Trump basically did not ratify the TPP, right? So something that they nurtured essentially is now off the table politically. The political environment has changed so much in the United States. There were unilateral tariffs imposed during the Trump administration, not just on China, but of course also the EU, Japan, South Korea. Now we can say there's been a break with the Biden administration to some extent, but we also have to remember that the tariffs, which are being challenged by China in the World Trade Organization, still remain in place. And the tariffs also really weren't simply just lifted on the EU and Japan. They're actually kind of leveraged to renegotiate trade deals, for example, with steel and aluminum, There is still, I think, a very different kind of political context now in which the administrations, the U.S. administrations, Democratic or Republican, think about trade. And as Ambassador Suzuki mentioned, there is some concern on the part of Japan that the U.S. seems to be departing from this idea of a rules-based order as it pertains to economic policy and trade. Now, in terms of the politics, you can just point to polls. The American public and the Japanese public don't look all that different. By and large, trade remains relatively popular in both countries. But of course, politics isn't about just polling, right? It depends on institutions and electoral systems, right? And I think, peculiar nature of our electoral map has really made it very difficult for the Biden administration that probably in its heart of hearts would want to consider re-engaging and maybe joining CPTPP makes it really kind of politically not possible at this moment. And so as a result, we've seen a divergence. I think Japan has been very gung-ho and proactive. It's played key leadership in pushing through the CPTPP. It also played a very important role in getting RCEP through, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And so at this stage, it's not clear when the U.S. will begin to align with Japan more on trade. But the bottom line is Japan's been more successful in signing these regional trade agreements. And also, I think that Ambassador Suzuki's comments really captured this. Japan is fundamentally more concerned and committed to the multilateral trading order, despite all of the challenges that it's faced. And especially the World Trade Organization and the dispute resolution mechanism. And so right now we can go into some of these details, but at least my last understanding is that the U.S. is not moving ahead with appointing new members to the appellate body of the WTO underneath the dispute resolution DSP, right, the dispute settlement body, because it wants to push for reforms. Now, the fact that they're at least trying to engage in WTO reform, I think, is a positive sign, but we'll have to see how the politics are complicated because the interests across the world and among the members of the WTO are pretty divergent. The other second area, I think, of some divergence is economic relations with China. Structurally, Japan is in a different place. It faces a much keener trade-off between its security and economic policies. In terms of security, it's very extreme. There's a territorial dispute, right? The sovereignty of its territory is at stake. As someone mentions, the Senkaku Islands in particular. Japan also has a now strategic interest in Taiwan, but the reality is that Japan is very heavily dependent on the Chinese market, right, and Chinese investment or investment into China. So in terms of the trade situation, Japan is twice as dependent on exports to China than the United States. Investment is still very high. As of 2020, 27% of all Japan's investment into Asia went still into China, despite, again, escalating geopolitical tensions. Also, these numbers don't capture the heavy amount of local production that's done in China. And the results are not surprising from surveys, which is that businesses, and again, I think Christy kind of touched on this, businesses in Japan still see China as an economic opportunity. And some surveys done by Jetro showed that China was viewed as the #1 opportunity for future business. So these are some big differences. Now, Kate on Rand, there are some issues, I think, where economic security might not be in a zero-sum relationship with worrying about their economic interests. For example, the economic security bill, which we can talk about, that's being discussed. Kate on Rand, the peak organization of large corporations, came out in support of it. And things like, for example, not disclosing patents that have sensitive technologies. And that's an area, I think, where business can get behind it. But the larger picture is still that Japanese companies look at the Chinese market as an important opportunity. And I think it's also someone asked about the aging and demographics. I think Mike mentioned that as well. I think it's also important to bear in mind that Japan does have a kind of unique demographic situation with its aging population, actually shrinking population, we should say. Domestic demand will decline. Japan will have to come up with new ways to generate income for the nation, which will require investment and also trade. Now, of course, China is not the only place that they can invest or trade, and Japan has looked towards Southeast Asia in particular for those opportunities, but it's questionable how far Southeast Asia could replace China. It's probably not feasible. So in some ways, we see a divergence. I think one big question to ask right now, though, is the Ukraine effect. To what extent will there be a spillover and a perception on the part of businesses that the risks are really high of doing business in China? Maybe some sectors and some firms will kind of reach that conclusion, but there potentially will be, I think, a big Ukraine effect that may shift the preferences of business so that they align greater with Japan's security interests. And I mentioned business, but I think even within the LDP and the government, there's also, again, the split between how much to emphasize the economic opportunities of China and how much to worry about the security risks. And we can look at RCEP partly through that lens, because RCEP, there are a lot of motives I think that Japan had, but certainly I think one of them was that RCEP would give Japan preferential access to the Chinese market. And so, again, there was that kind of motivation. So that's largely the gist of my comments. I do want to kind of echo this question about FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. One of its core principles is an open economy. I think there is some tension, in particular with the US and its vision of economic nationalism. So I think FOIP has been an organizing principle for Japan, and I think a useful and potentially powerful rhetorical tool. But as we see economic security matters come to the fore, there's a question about, does it come into tension, right, with FOIP? And I think actually, Christy, that was a point that she echoed also. So thank you very much. Look forward to the questions and comments.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Park, for a really interesting presentation. Okay, 3 questions I want to ask before we open it up to the room. The first is, I really like your outline of the harmonious relationship between the U.S. And Japan on a lot of these issues. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about the reason. I mean, you mentioned common interests, but I'd like to hear a little bit more detail about that, because historically, I mean, I think there have been a lot of periods where Japan and the U.S. have had common interests, but we haven't necessarily seen this degree of harmony. So I'm wondering what you think are some of the causes of that. And I guess my second 2 questions involve maybe looking towards the future. So the first is, I'm thinking about the possibility of a President Trump being elected in 2024. How are the Japanese anticipating that or thinking about that, and how might that influence the future of U.S.-Japan relations? I mean, given, as you mentioned, Trump's unpredictability and economic nationalism. And then second of all is, I like how you highlighted the asymmetry of the U.S.-Japan reliance on China and on trade with China. But given that, like, at what point might we expect that to sort of pull the U.S. and Japan apart more? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now we are moving to the discussion, and David Kahn already asked the question on the in the chat box. So in today's economy, this is a question to Catherine. In today's economy, developing new drugs and treatment in the U.S. is very risky in terms of success rates through all the regulations and trials, and very expensive. Operation Warp Speed has changed the landscape quite a bit. Do you think FDA, CDC, and related government entities will shift, streamline these regulations and processes, perhaps even change even change expensive new drugs and treatments, IP protection somewhat, and make them more accessible. So that question comes from David from the participants. Any others who want to raise the question or discussion? Okay, if you have a question, please raise your hand on the online. Also raise your hand if you have question, comments, or thoughts.
No, that's just my hand.
Oh yeah, that's actually yeah. Okay. Any other? Do you have any question or comments, students? Okay. Actually, I have a question for. I would like to add. So please be selective when you answer. My question to Christy is: you mentioned about the economic security in terms of automation, and then that's actually getting it even more and more important question. So could you comment a little bit more on that, like an automation in the context of economic security? My question to Catherine is who governs internationally? I think it's very important, and then definitely WHO is not functioning for that purpose. So what I can think of is WTO, but then WTO is not functioning as a rulemaking organization anymore, unfortunately. So free trade agreements like Trans-Pacific Partnership and others, and then actually they are doing certain jobs for intellectual property rights. So maybe that's actually the good candidate. So could you talk about global governance of pharmacy, and then my question to Jim is so you mentioned about flip of the Japanese attitude from the follower to the United States lead of the rulemaking to a leader of the rulemaking of international order, especially in terms of trade. What made it? You mentioned a little bit about interest groups, like agriculture is now very weak, but does it mean like businesses are much more active compared with the past? So could you talk a little bit about interest group politics of the Japanese flip of the attitude in terms of attitudes toward the leading the trade rulemaking? Okay, any question you want to add? Okay, so I would like to now ask each panelist to answer the questions. You can be selective. And if we still have time after that, we may go one more round. So if you have any question or thought, please think about it. So starting with Christy, could you come back and then talk about it?
Thanks for those interesting questions. So I didn't mention automation specifically, but it certainly was mentioned by Mike, and it's certainly an important question, as well as migration. So I guess I would start out by pointing out that being securitized is not necessarily a good thing. So sometimes it's good for galvanizing action or resources or things like that, but it can also politicize an issue in a negative way. And I think that, you see different kinds of manifestations of this. So with automation, I think, it depends on what precisely we're talking about, the technology and where it's being used, but certainly it's a security concern if you have issues about supply disruption that could particularly affect a critical sector or something like this, or if the type of automation has a specific type of technology that has perhaps a vulnerability, you may want to go with a trusted partner. So I think that, that's clearly something that as economies move in this direction, and this is the same conversation with things like smart cities and all of these different things where there's a lot of good to the technology, but there are also a lot of questions about it. So yes, that's something to be considered, and it's something people are thinking about. But then on the flip side, kind of what I pointed out in my presentation is that there are also concerns that that kind of logic would be applied too widely, and that it would lead to too many restrictions on, everybody saying everything was related to security, basically, and a lot of companies being locked out. So when you look at the domestic reactions to, for example, Japan's economic security legislation, companies like some parts, but a lot of the concerns you hear are, well, we want these considerations applied as narrowly as possible. We want things to be restricted for security reasons when they are related to security, and then we don't want it to affect other things. So I think that it's a concern, people recognize it, but then there's also this kind of pushback about, but at what point is this just, restricting some kinds of companies, or, restricting procurement in ways that are basically preventing a level playing field. So then with migration, I think it is in a lot of literature is discussed as a broader part of like human security issues or things like this. But in the kind of economic security discussions I was talking about, it's not typically brought up. And I think it interacts very uncomfortably with the domestic revitalization components of economic security policies, which tend to be a lot about like job creation, bringing domestic industries back home, and these types of things. I gave a presentation for a European audience on US supply chain strategy, for example, and a lot of that dialogue is about promoting basically domestic revitalization and addressing some of these trade inequities that people feel. And so I think that people don't usually talk about it that way, but if it did, it would probably lean in the way that, it would be better to have it done domestically, perhaps. So I think it depends on the country, though. But migration has certainly been politicized for other reasons and has been tied to this broader backlash against, international trade in many countries. So I think that's an interesting question, and, one that has attention. In terms of the broad notion of whether economic security, as we're discussing it as a problem, is a recognition of the failure of the Bretton Woods institutions, I think that's an excellent question, and it goes to sort of this push and pull of policy, and then, having to adapt policy to changing conditions. But I would point out that, economic security issues are quite old. They're as old as trade is. People have had, since there were mercantile nations, there's been concerns about having heavy dependence on countries and what that could mean. And it's really not that new in some ways. But then, I think what has happened is that people have recognized that the tools that policymakers have to, regulate certain kinds of practices or enforce certain kinds of policies are not adequate. And so that's a concern. And then more broadly, the concern about the trading system more expansively is definitely one that is troubling in terms of the future of the WTO or multilateral trade in general. So, my discussion was really focusing on sort of more bottom up, ad hoc coalitions of like-minded countries, but arguably that may not be effective for restoring some of these big visions. And then in one of the presentations we heard that, there's no appetite for that perhaps. So, it's a really big question. Just to answer one of the questions that was posed to Jean as well about, where would this interdependence with China that Japan has pull the US and Japan apart, I think. So I think that when you would start to see Japan pull away or get more concerned would be times when it becomes more of a punitive ask. So like if, for example, it becomes a question of sanctions on China, if it becomes an issue of regulating outbound investment from Japan into China, then I think that those would be things that would be, difficult. And there are some discussions about that, and they're not popular in the US with companies either. But I think that, if it were, right now it's not totally the old conversation about like hot economics, cold politics that we used to have where they were really separate. Like we see them blending and things becoming more problematic on both ends. But there is still a degree of separation, and companies still want to preserve that. So the more you want to pull that apart, then I think it becomes the trade-offs are more stark. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Kathy.
First of all, thank you to Michael for his questions, and also to our remote participants and to Hiroki. So I'm going to take one from each. The first one I'm going to answer is the provocative one that Michael raised, and that is the pharmaceutical industry is to some extent a generator of new ideas. And private sector in general is a generator of new ideas. And if we regulate or over-regulate or try to control on the part of government bureaucrats, we're going to really, fizzle out that brilliant, innovative activity. And I absolutely 100% agree. However, if you look at the data on the US pharmaceutical giants, actually, it's the government that's funding that basic research. And ultimately, the taxpayer that's funding that basic research. So the pharmaceutical companies are very, very good at taking discoveries that have already gone through proof of concept and prototype and scaling those discoveries, but they're not very good at those ideas, finding those gems or those kernels of brilliance and funding them. And that's why government funding is so important, because they're funding lots of little things all the time, and some things grow and some things fizzle out, but the companies are not in the business of really finding those fundamental new research ideas. It's actually the government funded by taxpayers, which people ask all the time, well, if that's the case, why doesn't the US government use their marching rights more often? Because, if they're paying for this discovery, why aren't they doing a better job of sharing the benefits of those discoveries? And that's a research question for a future project, but an important one. So thank you, Michael, for bringing it up. I'd like to respond to one of our remote participants, David, Operation Warp Speed. Excellent example. Thank you very much. But also, if you scratch the surface a little bit, you know that the American consumer patient is subsidizing the cost of drugs in other countries. And the reason for that is because we have no national health insurance scheme that controls pricing. Drug makers can price their drugs whatever the market will bear. And so what's happening in the United States is our patients, our insurance providers are really subsidizing patients in other countries. And pharmaceutical companies don't lie about that. They say, yes, absolutely. The fact that we can charge these prices in the United States. And also, another interesting trivia bit is that there are only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer marketing of drugs and pharmaceuticals. The United States is one, New Zealand is the other one. If anybody can answer me why New Zealand, I haven't figured that out yet, but we are one of the 2. And finally, the question by Hiroki, which also I think dovetails with some of the things that Christy and Jean were talking about in terms of this juncture where we are in, where everyone is concerned about the failure of global level multilateral organizations, because, at the end of the day, if China doesn't buy in as a stakeholder, those multilateral organizations are going to fail. And so one of my concerns, and I think that echoes what Christy and Jean were bringing up, is that what we have is sort of countries are deciding that, well, WTO is not really working for us. We're going to start engaging in these regional, bilateral, other parallel relationships with our trading partners. And at the end of the day, it's the power of the markets that are the carrot to private sector players. And if there's not a global entity that all the private sector, the big markets, at least in what they say in public, buy into, then I really have a concern. So, I mean, obviously part of my research critiques some of the aspects of the WTO, but I certainly would not want to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. So what we need is reform. We don't need revolution. We need a pragmatic Japanese style approach is what I would recommend. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jean.
Thank you for these questions, Hiroki and Michael. And I know there's all that stands us between us and lunch, so I'll be very, very brief. In terms of the common interest, why, Michael, you were asking, why is there such a convergence now? And I think the easy answer would be the phenomenon of China, right? Formidable power that's heavily interdependent with both of these countries, and its use of economic coercion and fear on the part of Japan and U.S. of dependence. So I think there's just a natural aligning of interests. Of course, it plays through domestic politics, as we discussed earlier. And you also asked about polarization and what happens if Trump becomes elected. Obviously, I think people across the world, in particular in Japan and Korea, are really thinking hard about that question. And I think Ambassador Suzuki's comments really reflected that anxiety, which is that he mentioned that coercion from the United States as well. He referred to the voluntary export restraints and so forth. So I have to imagine that it's front and center on the thinking of policymakers. On Hiroki's question about the flip, what accounts for it? There are probably a lot of reasons. I can think of three that come into my head. One is the electoral change that happened in 1994. I think the political scientists are very familiar with that. That change was largely seen as giving less influence to highly specialized interest groups like the agricultural lobby. The second would be the strengthening of the prime minister's office. We've seen a greater centralization of power in Japan over really the period of the 1990s, but culminating, I think, most in the 2000s, giving them more latitude to sign trade agreements and so forth. And then a third would be reforms to weaken the agricultural cooperatives, which have been a powerful lobby group. So I think those are the three big changes. But there are a lot of experts much more, I think, knowledgeable about that question than me, but thank you for that question.
Thank you. Thank you. So anybody who wants to give us last question, last comment, especially I'm actually tempted to ask my students who are taking the international political economy class right now, and we talk about the international political economy, and the professor has a tendency that if like a student doesn't raise a question, calling the name, but well, I will not do it. But any question you have? Okay. Well, any question from the audience? Okay. So then let's. So I'd like to have I have some thoughts and comments for the whole symposium. So but before heading for lunch, but so let's close the second panel now, and then moving to closing remarks. So please join me for thanking the all excellent panelists. Okay, so originally we scheduled Professor Jim Holyfield for joining us for commenting and giving closing remarks. We talked about him. We communicated. First of all, he is in Paris for his sabbatical. So he's my colleague, director of the Tower Center. But and then actually, Paris and France changed the time to moving to the daylight savings time past Sunday, and then so he realized that now he cannot speak from Paris at that time. So instead, I will pinch hit to close this symposium. And first of all, I'd like to thank the staff members of the Tower Center, Varanji and Ray Rafidi, led by Jennifer Apoti. So please join me for thanking those SMU Tower Center. Thank you again for the support from the Consul General of Japan in Houston. Thank you very much for coming. So I started with the two things that has been changing. So this morning, at the beginning of today's session, I started with the two things, raising two things that has been changed for last 4 decades, roughly saying. So since 1980s, and so one is China's economic rise. And then also China's political rise along with that. And then second is the emergence of global value chains. So I'd like to mention about this. So as Professor Newton said, actually, some of you, and also Catherine and Christy, Michael, actually, we actually were in Honolulu last week for a conference of Association of Asian Studies. So that was an in-person conference, and then I attended the in-person conference this year for the first time in, of course, 2 years, and maybe I did more. I ran into, in the conference site, I ran into Mr. Hiroyuki Akita, who is a prominent journalist, Japanese prominent journalist. And he is also a China specialist, and he has a Chinese language as well as English language. So he served as bureau chief of Beijing as well as Washington, D.C. Well, definitely he's one of the top journalists in Japan. So we ran into each other, and actually we had never met in person, but we actually talked over. We had talked over Zoom. So suddenly, he called me, and then he recognized me, although both were wearing masks. But anyway, so we had we decided to have a coffee together, and well, it was called coffee, but actually in terms of time wise, but actually he had a beer and I had cocktail. But he raised actually a very interesting question, but and then also interesting points. So actually one thing that I realized was Japanese realized that 224 is the new date that has changed the world. 224, February 24th, is the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And his point was 224 maybe another 9/11 for Japanese security standpoint. His point is, as I said at the beginning of today's session, so originally Bush administration was aware of the rise of China and the implication of the rise of China. So US was ready to change its China policy. And then 9/11 happened, so US had to go back to the more engagement, and then because the US needed cooperation with China. For last few years, especially after Biden administration came into office, US actually finally shifted US-China policy, focusing on the relationship with US allies. And then Japan is one of the most important allies for the United States to manage the relationship with China. And then Quad is one of them, and then also the Quad related to AUKUS, although of course Japan is not a part of AUKUS, but then Quad, and then AUKUS, and then Indo-Pacific, FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. That was the framework of that Japan was going to set, and then together with the United States, Japan expected the kind of new framework of managing China's rise. And then 224 occurred. And then, so now maybe the US attention may shift a little bit, at least, but significantly from China. That's actually one concern that Japan has. Another date that is important in case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is actually so-called 2/4. 2/4 is February 4th. Do you know what is the date? And then this is actually a very crucial date for China. Well, Will may know about it. That's the day that Xi Jinping signed the agreement with Russia, saying that unlimited cooperation with Russia. My interpretation, which is shared by many people, including Mr. Akita,
is Xi Jinping didn't think that Russia will invade Ukraine. If he thinks that would be the real possibility, then he would not have signed such an agreement. Well, my interpretation is really that Xi Jinping was deceived by Putin. And now China is facing, confronting a very limited choice. And then I love the words like pro-Russian neutrality, and then it doesn't work, right? So I think that now China only has two choices. One of the two choices: one, try to defend Russia to the end, or cutting Russia at some point. And Akita-san thought China couldn't cut Russia, so maybe continuing the current kind of pro-Russia neutrality. That's actually pro-Russia defending Russia position for at least for good, for an indefinite period of time. I think China may cut Russia at some point, and then I think it's. I don't think it is what China wants to do, but I think that China has no choice. Number one, and also I think that still the Chinese government is smart enough to cut Russia at some point, and then try to seek somehow cooperation, collaboration with the Western states, including the United States. So that's actually one thing that's a new situation that was brought by Russia's invasion to Ukraine. In 2018, we had a similar symposium, of course in a different format because it was far before pandemic. We received support from Japanese Consulate General of Japan in Houston. We actually hold a conference on China, and Japanese government at that time was interested in having a conference on China. I think some of you were there, and asked us to get China scholars in North America together, and then we discussed China's rise, and also sort of the China challenge. And we had the keynote speaker, Dr. Tom Christensen, who is now teaching at Columbia University. At that time, he was in Princeton, and he wrote a book titled "The China Challenge." In 2018, toward the end, he at that time, in that conference, Professor Holyfield gave closing remarks, so he said it seems that it's very pessimistic tones. China's future, the future of the China's rise, implications of China's rise, it seems it's pessimistic. And then I thought it wouldn't be so pessimistic, but maybe he was right, considering what has happened since then. I think that still managing China's rise is still very challenging. And the one reason is China is a huge player in interdependent economy. So as the Ambassador Suzuki said last night, China is a major player, and then so we cannot we cannot turn away from China. Decoupling with China, one that's not good, but not just not good, but actually almost suicidal, I would say. So we have to incorporate China. That's not a choice. And then the question is really how. So coming back to the global value chains, and then what is the Japanese role? So I want to go with Dr. Park's point of flipping Japan's position. One amazing thing that has happened for the last few years is Japan started reading the rulemaking of international trade. When President Trump withdrew United States from Trans-Pacific Partnership on, if I remember correctly, day 3 after his inauguration, well, following his campaign promise. Well, most of the people, if not all, but it's not actually all, but almost all the people said then the TPP was dead. You know, if US doesn't lead the TPP, then the TPP would go nowhere. Interestingly, a little bit before that, I think as when Trump was elected to be a president of the United States in November 2016, our friend Dr. Mireya Solis at the Brookings Institution wrote an op-ed, and then this is an opportunity, and then for Japan. Now US doesn't lead trade rulemaking. Somebody has to lead, so Japan should. And then she told me that after that, almost everybody said, no way, right? But, you know, reality is, you know, it happened, right? So what many people thought, no way, happened. And then one thing is that yesterday, Ambassador Suzuki really emphasized, now the rulemaking of trade has been changing a lot. Right, so you may remember, it's originally it was a tariff, border measures, but now actually domestic regulation, right? Why it's domestic regulation? Because the global value chain, which means the major trading doesn't occur between producers to the consumers. Now it's actually the trading occurs between the producer and producer, and so in that sense, foreign direct investment, right? So the producers, businesses, investment in foreign countries is crucially important. And then how to protect the asset of your country. So Japanese companies, they invest in the foreign countries, and then they're doing the business, and that's actually a major player of trade. And then their main concern is how to protect their assets, their property rights, right? So, and then that's actually the TPP is a major purpose, and that's why the Japanese businesses were really pro FTA now. And then that's actually one of the reasons. So I agree with Jean about why Japan flipped, and then I all agree that an electoral reform matters. Without administrative reform, without a strengthened prime minister's power, Japanese positions change. Japanese threat would not have happened. But actually, I would add one more factor, that is that businesses are much more eager to push Japanese government to lead the rulemaking of trade, because that is protecting. That is actually not just promoting trade, but that is protecting their foreign direct investment. That's actually a new word. And then also finally, coming back to the China's right. Somehow, actually, Chinese private sectors, especially, they are quite competitive. And so they actually share the interest in the trade and then international economic interactions. So I think that there is some hope for China to be interested in being involved in the global governance of international economic interactions. And so if China turns to that direction, world probably would become more stable. Well, would it happen? Well, right now, very difficult. And as Professor Norris said, well, nothing would happen until November of this year. National Party Congress would happen. For Xi Jinping, Russian invasion of Ukraine is a really disturbing factor, because his priority has been nothing sensitive to happen. But now it happened, and then so he is in a very difficult position. And at the same time, his main concern is making sure that he will get the third term. in the National Party Congress in this probably which will take in October, which will take place in October or November. Finally, sorry, one more thing that I add is one of the concerns that I have is we are in the U.S. and especially we are in Texas, so we may think like now world is opening, right? So moving towards like post-COVID era, Asia is not. Okay, so Japan finally stopped so-called foreigner ban on March 1st. But to me, it was too little and too late. That's why we had to cancel SM in Japan program this summer. But other countries like China is still even more closed. And then China impose a new lockdown today in Shanghai, but not just in Shanghai. Right? I heard that Jilin province has also a new regulation, new lockdown. I think that especially the case of China, Chinese people will not go travel for at least like until 2023. So which means the Chinese people, ordinary people, will not go abroad, will not have any interaction with foreigners at least until 2023. So for 3 years altogether. That's actually that will have huge implications. Already the Japanese public also is moving toward more internal, and many Japanese people are not aware of the impact of the depreciation of the yen right now, and then because they do not go abroad. So why is it concerning? Because there is an interesting story that is sounds like a joke, but it's not a joke. That is, Chinese people come to Japan and they are surprised because Japan is so peaceful. They thought Japan was very militaristic. Well, it doesn't mean that Chinese textbooks are teaching them that Japan is still militaristic. Their textbook stops during the World War II, and how militaristic Japan was in the first half of the 20th century, and then they stopped it. So that's why at least some public of Chinese have a kind of understanding that maybe Japan is still militaristic, and then they come to Japan and then they finally realize, okay, so this is the reality. So that's actually so stopping the interaction of the people is very will have a significantly negative impact. And that's actually my concern. So hopefully both China and Japan will open the borders. I think that China is very difficult because of the National Party Congress. But Japan, hopefully more interactions with the other countries will start. And I'd like to stop here. It was a very stimulating discussion. I learned a lot and I enjoyed a lot. Thank you very much for the panelists, and thank you for those who attend the symposium. And I hope there is something you find somehow find it interesting. Please join me for thanking everybody who participates in this symposium. Now we will have lunch, and also we have a keynote speaker. The lunch will be ready in a moment, and so please, we will adjourn here, and then we will come back at noon, and then so the lunch will be ready soon. So it will be here. So please stay here and.